It began with stone, not the kind shaped gently by time, but the kind carved deliberately by human hands, with fear and ambition mixed into every block. Long before the thunder of Allied artillery echoed across Western Germany, the Siegfried Line already stretched across the hills like a scar. Concrete bunkers rose from forests and meadows, as if the earth itself had grown armor. Teeth of reinforced barriers, those rows of dragon's teeth jutted out of the soil like the bones of a buried giant. Pillboxes crouched behind slopes, waiting, tunnels wrapped beneath the land in cold, echoing coils. Even in peacetime, the Siegfried Line did not feel peaceful. It felt watchful. Thousands of workers had built it in the late 1930s, pouring concrete until their hands cracked, shaping walls thick enough to defy artillery, positioning, firing slits that peered out over valleys where quiet farms stood unchanged for generations. The bunkers were dead structures when empty, silent chambers of grey. But the moment soldiers stepped inside, the air filled with something different, something heavier than breath. For the German High Command, the Siegfried Line represented reassurance. For civilians living nearby, it represented tension. For the Allies approaching it in 1944, it represented a long shadow stretching across the final miles of the war. The soldiers advancing from France knew the stories. They had heard that the Siegfried Line was impenetrable, a wall of concrete and steel stretching hundreds of miles, filled with guns, mines, trenches, and hidden tunnels. They'd been told it was a relic of the past, then told it was stronger than ever, then told it was a myth meant to intimidate rather than stop them. None of those descriptions matched the truth. The truth was much more unsettling. The Siegfried Line was whatever the soldiers found when they reached its edge, and no two approaches were the same. Some units marched toward open hills where dragon's teeth gleamed in the frost like rows of jagged white stones. Others pushed through dark forests where bunkers waited behind tree trunks wrapped in fog. Others approached villages that looked abandoned, only to realize the cellars hid fighting positions connected by narrow tunnels. The closer the Allies came, the more the land changed. Fields grew silent. Birdsong faded. Wind carried the faint metallic scent of old concrete. The horizon began to break into unnatural shapes, not hills, but fortifications rising from the ground in angles too sharp to be natural. Then came the first shots. They echoed through the hills with a strangely hollow sound, bouncing off bunker walls and ricocheting through forests until direction became meaningless. Machine guns barked from embrasures so small they seemed invisible until fired upon. Mortar rounds arced over ridgelines, drifting through the cold air before slamming into the soil with bursts of smoke and frozen earth. Wire entanglements lay hidden under fallen leaves. Mines lurked beneath snow. Every metre forward demanded caution. To assault the Siegfried Line was not to fight an army, it was to fight architecture. Concrete does not panic. Steel does not hesitate. Stone does not retreat. The soldiers moved slowly, inch by inch. Engineers crawled forward with wire cutters, their breath fogging the air. Infantry lay flat in wet grass as bullets snapped overhead. Tanks rumbled forward only to smash against anti-tank ditches carved like trenches of stone. Artillery shook the ground so violently that dust drifted from the ceilings of underground bunkers. Some bunkers fell quickly. Others refused to fall at all until the men inside were cut off or completely overwhelmed. Inside those bunkers, the air was stale and cold. Lantern light flickered across walls thick enough to withstand direct hits. Soldiers listened to footsteps above them, artillery striking outside, the thunder of tanks grinding across dragon's teeth. They felt vibrations through the concrete, the tremor of battle approaching with heavy breath. As the Allies pushed deeper, passing one fortification after another, the Siegfried Line revealed its true nature. It was not a single wall, not a single barrier, not a single line. It was a labyrinth, scattered, layered, unpredictable, a puzzle built across hundreds of miles, with each piece waiting to be solved under fire. Rain turned fields into mud that swallowed boots. Fog rolled in so thick that entire battalions vanished into white haze. Forest floors were littered with damp pine needles that muted footsteps. Winters froze the concrete until it felt like touching ice. Every movement became slower. Every decision became heavier. And still the Allies pressed on. Battles raged in villages with roofs blown open, in forests where trunks splintered under machine gun fire, in valleys where bunkers stood like silent guardians refusing to budge. City by city, ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker, the Siegfried Line cracked, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a long, grueling, unraveling as the war ground forward. By early 1945, the line still existed, but its meaning had changed. No longer a symbol of impenetrability, it had become a reminder of how fiercely the past clings to the present, how structures built from fear and ambition can endure long after their purpose fades. The Allies marched through gaps widened by shellfire. The German defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, fought with what strength remained. And the Siegfried Line, ancient in spirit, despite being barely a decade old, stood witness as the war crossed into its final, bitter months. Tonight, we return to that immense, haunting barrier, to the dragon's teeth jutting from the earth, to the concrete bunkers buried beneath moss and frost, to the forests whispering with winter wind, to the slow, grinding struggle that unfolded across its length, a contest between men and fortification, fear and determination, shadow and flame. Before we continue deeper, I want to ask you something gentle, something rooted in your own moment. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what hour drifts softly around you? Is it late where you are, or is the night just beginning to settle, and something deeper shaped only for this episode? The Siegfried Line reminds us that barriers, whether built of concrete or memory, often look unbreakable until the moment someone takes the first step toward them. In your own life, has there been a barrier, internal or external, that you eventually found the strength to move through? If you want, share what that experience taught you. And if these long, atmospheric journeys through the past help your breath soften, your thoughts unwind, and your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. September 11th, 1944, Lieutenant James Delmont of the 5th Armoured Division's Reconnaissance Unit stood at the German border near Stalzenberg, staring at something his intelligence briefings had mentioned only in passing. Rows of concrete pyramids stretched across the valley floor like dragon's teeth, each one 3 to 5 feet tall, staggered in patterns designed to rip the belly from any tank that tried to cross. Behind them, camouflaged against the tree line, he could see the dark rectangles of bunker firing ports watching him. His radio man whispered what they were all thinking. They told us this place was abandoned. The ghost wall, as the Germans had called it during 4 years of neglect, was very much alive. 2 months earlier, Paris had fallen to jubilant Allied forces who danced through streets showered with flowers and champagne. The German army was in headlong retreat across France, leaving behind shattered divisions and abandoned equipment. American and British commanders spoke openly of ending the war by Christmas, of a German collapse so complete that organised resistance would simply evaporate. Supply lines stretched back to Normandy beaches, but the prevailing mood was one of inevitable victory, accelerating toward its conclusion. No one seriously believed that Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall would find a twin on Germany's western border, or that if such fortifications existed, they would be defended with any conviction. The intelligence assessments filtering down to frontline units described the Westwall, as the Germans called it, as a relic from the late 1930s, a propaganda showpiece likely stripped of weapons and left to rot while Germany threw everything into the desperate Eastern Front battles. September 12th brought the first real test. Delmont's patrol had reported their findings, and by dawn, elements of the 1st Infantry Division were probing the defences near Aachen. What happened next shattered the optimistic assumptions that had carried Allied forces across France. A platoon approached what appeared to be a simple concrete bunker, grass-covered and seemingly inactive. The accompanying Sherman tank fired its 75mm gun at 200 yards range. The shell struck the bunker's face and ricocheted into the air with a sound like a bell being struck, leaving only a small scar on the concrete. German machine guns opened fire from firing ports invisible until that moment, and from positions to the left and right that the Americans hadn't even seen. The platoon went to ground, pinned down in a kill zone that had been engineered 8 years earlier for exactly this purpose. It took 3 hours and 2 more Shermans before engineers could get close enough to silence the position with satchel charges dropped through a rear entrance. By September 14th, intelligence officers were frantically revising their assessments as reports flooded in from all along the newly formed front. The Siegfried Line wasn't a thin crust of border defences. It was a zone of fortifications extending 4 to 6 kilometres deep in most places, comprising an estimated 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, observation posts, and command centres. The Dragon's Teeth obstacles that had so shocked Delmont's patrol stretched for 390 miles from the Dutch border in the north all the way to Switzerland in the south. Underground tunnels connected major positions. Interlocking fields of fire meant that attacking one bunker brought you under observation and fire from 3 or 4 others. The Americans had expected to encounter something like the border fortifications they'd bypassed around St. Malo or brushed aside at the Seine crossings. Instead, they faced something that hadn't been seen since the Western Front of the First World War, a genuinely fortified line designed to channel, trap, and destroy attacking forces through pure engineering. The psychological impact rippled through the American ranks faster than official communications could manage. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to German retreats now faced an enemy fighting from concrete bunkers that their standard weapons couldn't penetrate. The easy camaraderie of the French campaign gave way to grim calculation of odds and distances. Officers trained in mobile warfare found themselves planning assaults that would have been familiar to their fathers. Artillery preparation, frontal assault, overwhelming firepower, concentrated on tiny objectives. A captain in the 28th Infantry Division wrote in a letter home that would later be seized by censors, "We thought we were racing to Berlin. Turns out we're crawling through concrete." The supreme confidence that had carried American forces from Normandy was encountering something it hadn't prepared for. An enemy that refused to retreat, fighting from positions that seemed immune to everything short of direct artillery hits. On the night of September 14th, soldiers in forward positions near the border heard something that drove home how completely the war had changed character. Loudspeakers crackled to life in the darkness, and a woman's voice in perfect English began to speak. She called herself Sally, and American soldiers would come to know her as Axis Sally, though her real name was Mildred Gillers. Her broadcast that night was tailored specifically to the troops now facing the Westwall. "Hello, boys. Welcome to Fortress Europe. I hope you enjoyed your vacation in France. Now the real war begins. Do you really think your tanks can break through walls that are 3 meters thick? Your generals are sending you to die against concrete. Go home to your sweethearts while you still can." The propaganda was crude, but it struck a nerve because it echoed the doubts already forming in soldiers' minds. They had seen their shells bounce off bunkers. They had watched friends cut down in fields of fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The ghost wall was no ghost at all. By mid-September, supply officers were recalculating everything. The pre-operation estimates had called for 2 weeks of hard fighting to breach the border defences, followed by a rapid advance to the Rhine River and beyond. Ammunition allocation had been based on mobile warfare consumption rates, not the kind of methodical bunker busting that was now clearly required. Suddenly, artillery shells that were supposed to last for a quick breakthrough were being expended at rates that threatened to outstrip supply within weeks. Medical facilities designed to handle the casualties from mobile operations were seeing wounded from the kind of close-range combat that hadn't been common since the Normandy hedgerows. Most troubling of all, the replacement system wasn't prepared for the kind of attritional warfare that concrete fortifications imposed. Every captured bunker cost lives, and there were 18,000 bunkers to capture. The Germans defending these positions were not the elite troops that had held Normandy, nor were they the panzer divisions that had made the Wehrmacht's reputation. They were a mixture of garrison troops who had spent years guarding empty concrete. Volksgrenadier units hastily formed from older men and barely trained recruits, and whatever regular Wehrmacht units could be scraped together from the retreating armies. Many of them were as surprised as the Americans to find themselves actually fighting from these positions. A captured German corporal from the 2nd 146th Volksgrenadier Division told his interrogators a story that revealed the chaos behind the concrete. "In August, we were told to occupy the bunkers. When we arrived, there were no weapons. We had to wait 3 weeks for machine guns to be delivered from depots in the east. The firing ports had been sealed with bricks. We used sledgehammers to break them open." The Siegfried Line that American forces encountered in September 1944 was simultaneously more formidable than expected and more improvised than anyone realized. Lieutenant Delmont's patrol report had included a detail that wouldn't be fully understood for weeks. He had noted that vegetation around the bunkers was overgrown, that rust stains marked the concrete where metal fittings had corroded, that the camouflage paint was faded and peeling. These were signs of neglect, of years of abandonment. But there were also signs that the Germans had recently returned to these positions, that someone had decided the Westwall would fight again. American intelligence officers studying these reports began to ask a question that would shape the entire campaign. If these fortifications had been abandoned for years, stripped of their weapons, and left to decay, why were they now defended with such determination? The answer to that question lay buried in 8 years of history in decisions made in Berlin, when Hitler still believed his western border needed defending, in the frantic August of 1944, when that border suddenly needed defending again, and in the desperate calculation of German commanders who had no mobile reserves left and only concrete to hide behind. The illusion of easy victory had lasted exactly 3 months, from the breakout from Normandy in late June to the encounter with the Dragon's Teeth in early September. Now, as autumn rain began to fall on the German border, American commanders faced a choice between brutal honesty and stubborn optimism. The Siegfried Line could not be wished away or bypassed. Every mile forward would cost blood and time. The question was how much blood, how much time, and whether the American army could learn fast enough to reduce that cost before winter came. The ghost wall had declared itself very real indeed, and somewhere behind those concrete bunkers, German commanders who had spent August desperately trying to arm and man abandoned fortifications allowed themselves a moment of hope. Perhaps the line would hold after all. Perhaps there was still time to avoid the inevitable. Perhaps concrete could buy what courage and numbers no longer could. A few more months, a negotiated peace, some escape from total defeat. They were wrong, but it would take 6 months of the bloodiest fighting on the Western Front to prove it. May 1936. Fritz Todt stood in Adolf Hitler's office in the Reich Chancellery, spreading engineering diagrams across the Führer's desk while rain hammered against the windows. The Rhineland had been remilitarized 3 months earlier in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, and now Hitler was demanding something that most of his generals considered impossible: a fortified line matching the French Maginot Line, built in a fraction of the time, stretching the entire western border of Germany. Todt, who had built the Autobahn network and would later organize the massive Atlantic Wall construction, understood what Hitler really wanted wasn't military necessity but psychological armor. Germany had torn up the treaty, and Hitler needed to look strong, while France decided whether to crush him before he became unstoppable. The fortifications weren't really meant to fight France, they were meant to prevent France from fighting at all. The timing reveals everything about Hitler's thinking in those early years of Nazi expansion. The Maginot Line, France's answer to the trauma of the First World War, stretched along the Franco-German border like a concrete barrier between two bitter enemies. It had cost France billions of francs and taken years to build, and it sent a clear message: never again would German armies simply march into France. Hitler's Rhineland gamble had called France's bluff, marching troops into the demilitarized zone and daring France to respond with force. When France hesitated, paralyzed by political division and fear of another war, Hitler knew he had a window of vulnerability. If France realized how weak Germany still was, how dependent on bluff and timing, they might attack before German rearmament could create genuine military power. The Westwall project was insurance against that moment of French clarity, a visible, concrete reminder that attacking Germany would be costly even in 1936. Todt's challenge was unprecedented in modern engineering. He had perhaps 2 years, maybe 3, before Germany's other provocations made war inevitable. The fortification line needed to stretch 390 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland. It needed to appear intimidating enough to deter French aggression, but be buildable with the limited resources of a Germany still recovering from depression and hyperinflation. His solution was pragmatic and deeply flawed in ways that would only become clear 8 years later. The bunkers would be small, quick to build, designed around machine guns and anti-tank weapons rather than the heavy artillery that dominated the Maginot Line. They would be built in incredible numbers, saturating the landscape with concrete to create the psychological impression of impregnability. Quality would vary based on location and urgency, with the strongest bunkers facing France's most likely attack routes and weaker structures filling in the gaps. Most critically, construction would be rushed, using every shortcut that wouldn't cause immediate structural failure. The Munich crisis of September 1938 transformed Todt's manageable challenge into an impossible one. Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland brought Europe to the brink of war, and suddenly the Westwall needed to be finished, not in years, but in weeks. 500,000 workers were mobilized, including members of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the organization Todt's own construction brigades, and private contractors pulled from every major building project in Germany. They worked in 24-hour shifts, pouring concrete by torchlight, racing against diplomatic deadlines. Quality control disintegrated under the pressure. Concrete that should have cured for weeks was covered and deemed ready after days. Steel reinforcement bars were placed with spacing that maximized coverage rather than strength. Some bunkers were declared complete when they were barely weatherproof, let alone bomb-proof. On October 1st, 1938, Hitler announced the Westwall's completion to the world with typical bombast, the strongest fortification line ever built by man. The propaganda photographs showed impressive concrete structures disappearing into the distance, a dragon's teeth barrier that looked unstoppable. The truth visible in Organisation Tott's classified reports told a different story. Construction had consumed 8.7 million cubic meters of concrete, more than any engineering project in German history except the Autobahn system itself. The cost had reached 3.5 billion Reichsmarks, equivalent to roughly $20 billion in modern currency, an enormous sum for an economy still struggling with debt from the previous war. But quantity had triumphed over quality in ways that would haunt the structures. Laboratory tests of concrete samples revealed wild inconsistency, with some bunkers meeting or exceeding design specifications, while others crumbled under standard load testing. The rushed curing process had left internal weaknesses that wouldn't be immediately visible. Steel reinforcement, already used sparingly due to Germany's metal shortage, was often placed too close to the concrete surface, where moisture could cause corrosion. Underground tunnels connecting bunker complexes were poorly waterproofed, and in many locations, they leaked or flooded within months of completion. None of these problems mattered in the immediate term because the Westwall never fought the war it was designed for. When Germany attacked France in May 1940, Wehrmacht forces bypassed their own fortifications entirely, pouring through Belgium and the Netherlands in a repetition of the Schlieffen Plan that had nearly worked 26 years earlier. The Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line faced each other across the border, like boxers who never threw a punch. French troops probed the German fortifications in a few places during the phony war period, but never launched a serious offensive. German troops manning the Westwall during those months spent their time in grim concrete boxes, waiting for an attack that never came, guarding a line that turned out to be irrelevant the moment mobile warfare demonstrated its supremacy over static defense. By June 1940, France had surrendered, and the Westwall garrison troops found themselves occupying a line of fortifications that had seen virtually no combat. The 4 years between 1940 and 1944 might be the most important in understanding what the Allies encountered in September. The Westwall became a backwater, a place to station garrison troops who were too old, too young, or too valuable to risk on active fronts. Weapons were systematically stripped from the bunkers and sent east, where the Wehrmacht desperately needed every machine gun and anti-tank gun for the grinding battles in Russia. By 1943, an estimated 85% of the original weapons had been removed. Some bunkers were converted into air raid shelters for local civilians. Others became storage facilities for military equipment or simply sealed up and abandoned. Vegetation grew over the concrete, camouflage paint faded, and the dragon's teeth obstacles became landmarks that farmers worked around. Teenagers who had watched the frantic construction in 1938 played war games in the empty bunkers, exploring tunnels that smelled of dampness and rust. The propaganda lived on even as the reality decayed. Throughout the war, Goebbels' propaganda ministry continued to reference the Westwall as part of Fortress Europe, the supposedly impregnable barrier that would protect Germany from invasion. Axis Sally's broadcasts to Allied troops mentioned the fortifications as though they were still the formidable structures of 1938. German civilians living near the border took some psychological comfort from the concrete presence, even if they rarely saw soldiers manning the positions. For Hitler, the Westwall remained a symbol of Germany's defensive strength, something to reference in speeches, even as he committed virtually every mobile unit to offensive operations in the east. The reality was that by mid-1944, as the Allied armies raced across France, the Siegfried Line existed primarily as a memory and a name on maps that nobody had seriously examined in years. When disaster struck in Normandy and Allied forces broke through German lines, racing toward the German border, someone in the Wehrmacht had to face an awkward question. What exactly was the condition of the Westwall? Staff officers dispatched inspection teams in August 1944 discovered a situation that ranged from poor to catastrophic depending on location. Major bunker complexes still had structural integrity, but most lacked weapons, ammunition, and even basic supplies. Command and control systems had been cannibalized for parts, underground cables had been pulled out and sent elsewhere. The few garrison troops still technically assigned to Westwall duty were scattered across other assignments. Documents in archives reveal the mounting panic in these reports. One inspector near Aachen noted that of 47 bunkers inspected, 41 had no weapons at all, and the remaining 6 had machine guns without ammunition. Another report from the Saarland sector described bunkers with firing ports sealed by brickwork, installed by engineers who had needed the space for storage and hadn't bothered to maintain combat readiness. The gap between the Westwall of propaganda and the Westwall of reality created the conditions for everything that followed. Had Hitler built a genuinely powerful fortification line and maintained it through the war, the September 1944 encounter would have been very different, either stopping the Allies completely or forcing them to develop different strategies much earlier. Had the line been purely propaganda with no substance, the Allies would have swept through it in days. Instead, they encountered something far more complicated. A line that was simultaneously dilapidated and formidable, abandoned and defended, obsolete and dangerous. The rush construction of 1938 had created bunkers that varied wildly in quality, but even the weakest concrete was still concrete. The neglect of 1940 to 44 had stripped away weapons and readiness, but the structures themselves remained. And in the desperate August of 1944, Germany would attempt to resurrect this ghost wall and make it fight one more time. Fritz Todt, who died in a plane crash in 1942, never saw his fortifications tested in the war he had helped build them for. The test, when it finally came, would reveal both the genius and the fatal flaws of building to impress rather than building to last. August 24th, 1944, General Alfred Schlemm walked through a bunker complex near Aachen, his boots echoing in empty concrete chambers that smelled of mildew and abandonment. As the newly appointed commander of the 1st Parachute Army, tasked with defending this section of the Westwall, he was conducting his first inspection of the positions his men were supposed to hold. What he found made him physically ill. The bunker's machine gun ports had been bricked over from the inside. The steel door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Water pooled on the floor from a leak in the ventilation shaft. Most damningly, every weapon that should have been stored here had vanished, leaving only the mounting brackets and ammunition racks to hint at what was missing. Behind him, his aide was compiling a list that would run to 17 pages by day's end. Missing weapons, missing equipment, missing basic readiness. Schlemm turned to his staff officers and spoke words that would be repeated in different forms by dozens of German commanders. That desperate August, we have been given corpses to defend. The full scope of the disaster became clear only as inspection teams fanned out across the entire line in the last week of August. In sectors that had once been considered the strongest parts of the Westwall, inspectors found bunkers that had been systematically looted for anything useful. Machine guns had been removed first, sent east to desperate infantry divisions facing Russian offensives. Anti-tank guns had followed, desperately needed as the Red Army deployed seemingly endless numbers of 34 tanks. By 1943, even basic materials like copper wiring, steel reinforcement exposed during modifications, and ventilation equipment had been scavenged for other purposes. Some bunkers near population centres had been unofficially converted into expanded cellars for civilian homes, their firing ports permanently sealed, their interiors subdivided for storage. Others had served as temporary shelters for refugees fleeing Allied bombing raids, leaving behind the detritus of civilian occupation, blankets, cooking equipment, personal items abandoned when the residents moved on. The weapons shortage was only the most obvious problem. Command and control infrastructure had disintegrated through 4 years of neglect. Telephone lines connecting bunker complexes had been cut and rolled up for copper salvage. Buried cables had corroded, and nobody had maintained the communication trenches that were supposed to allow runners to move between positions under cover. Observation posts had lost their optical equipment, making coordinated fire impossible even if weapons could be restored. Perhaps most critically, the detailed maps and fire plans that had been prepared in the late 1930s were either lost or hopelessly outdated, having been modified repeatedly as German forces used the bunkers for purposes their designers never intended. A battalion commander in the Saarland sector reported to his superiors that he had inherited positions where the defenders literally didn't know which bunkers covered which approaches because the original tactical plans existed only in fragmentary copies and the positions had been modified so many times that old plans were actively misleading. Hitler's response to these reports combined typical delusion with flashes of accurate understanding of Germany's desperate situation. On August 30th, he issued a directive declaring that the Westwall must hold at all costs, that every bunker must be defended, that there would be no retreat. The directive acknowledged that equipment was lacking but insisted this could be overcome by will and determination. More practically, it ordered immediate mobilization of resources to reactivate the line, weapons to be stripped from coastal defense positions that the Allies had already bypassed, ammunition to be diverted from training facilities, construction materials to be requisitioned from civilians, and, most controversially, labor to be conscripted from local populations and supplemented by slave workers. The timeline demanded was staggering. Major positions to be reoccupied and armed within 2 weeks, the entire line to be combat-ready within 6 weeks. Given that many bunkers lacked basic necessities like clean water or functioning ventilation, this timeline was pure fantasy. Yet German efficiency, that strange mix of competence and desperation that characterized the Wehrmacht's final year, achieved something remarkable in those September weeks. Organisation TOT, the same construction group that had built the line originally, mobilized emergency repair crews. They couldn't restore the line to its theoretical 1938 strength, but they could make it functional enough to fight. Machine guns appeared, pulled from coastal fortifications in Denmark and the Netherlands where they guarded beaches the Allies would never invade. Anti-tank guns were cannibalized from training units and depot facilities. Ammunition arrived in quantities that were barely adequate but better than nothing. Most importantly, soldiers arrived. Garrison troops from France rushed east before they could be cut off. Convalescent battalions pulled from military hospitals. Volkssturm units formed from men aged 45 to 60, and whatever regular Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units could be scraped together from the shattered armies retreating from France. The quality of these defenders revealed the true state of Germany's military by late 1944. A typical Volksgrenadier division defending the Westwall in September might have a paper strength of 10 to 12,000 men, but actual strength of 6 to 8,000. Of these, perhaps 30% were experienced combat veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front or the Normandy battles, who had recovered from wounds and been sent west. Another 40% were older men or young recruits with minimal training, some having fired their weapons only a handful of times. The remaining 30% were a mixture of the partially disabled, recovered, wounded, not quite fit for frontline service, and what German commanders euphemistically called special assignments, men whose political reliability or ethnic background made them unsuitable for trusted positions, but who could still hold a bunker and fire a machine gun. Equipment shortages meant rifles might be mixed calibers, ammunition might not match weapons perfectly, and communications equipment might consist of civilian telephones requisitioned from local exchanges. September 3rd marked the moment when desperation turned to frantic activity. Allied reconnaissance patrols had reached the German border, and forward units were probing the defences. The time for inspection and planning was over. The line had to fight with whatever readiness it could achieve. Local Nazi Party officials, the Gauleiter who ruled their districts with fanatic loyalty to Hitler, took increasingly direct control over defensive preparations. They had the authority to conscript civilian labour, requisition materials, and execute anyone they deemed defeatist or treasonous. In some sectors, this produced remarkable results. Civilians working around the clock to clear fields of fire, improvise obstacles, and prepare supply routes. In other sectors, it produced chaos, conflicting orders from party officials and Wehrmacht commanders, resources hoarded or wasted, and an atmosphere of terror that did nothing to improve actual defensive readiness. The improvisation extended to the fortifications themselves. Engineers discovered that many Dragon's Teeth obstacles had been bypassed or removed by farmers who needed to move equipment across fields. They couldn't replace these in time, so they created improvised barriers using whatever materials were available. Railroad ties, concrete rubble from bombed buildings, even disabled vehicles positioned to block likely approach routes. Mining operations that should have laid thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines along approach routes barely managed a fraction of this, hampered by ammunition shortages that prioritized artillery shells over mines. Camouflage that had been allowed to decay was hastily restored using branches, netting, and paint that wouldn't fool aerial reconnaissance, but might confuse ground-level attackers. The goal wasn't to create the perfect defense, but to create enough of a defense that attacking would be costly. By mid-September, when American forces made their first serious contact with the line, the Westwall was neither the fortress of propaganda nor the abandoned relic that initial inspections had suggested. It was something stranger and more dangerous. An improvised defense built on the skeleton of an obsolete fortification, manned by desperate men with inadequate equipment, commanded by a mixture of fanatics who believed in final victory and professionals who knew they were buying time for defeat. The bunkers varied wildly in effectiveness. Some were genuine strongpoints with interlocking fire and adequate supplies, while others were concrete boxes with rust-jammed doors and scared old men manning captured French rifles. The strength of individual positions mattered less than the collective whole, a zone of fortifications deep enough and numerous enough that destroying them one by one would take time, cost lives, and give Germany something it desperately needed but could never admit wanting: a few more months before the end. The psychological element cannot be understated. German defenders knew they were fighting for their homeland now, not for conquests in Russia or occupation duty in France. The concrete around them might be crumbling, their weapons might be mismatched hand-me-downs, their training might consist of a few days' instruction from an exhausted veteran, but they were defending Germany itself. That knowledge produced a determination that better-equipped, better-trained troops often lacked when defending foreign soil. For many of these men, especially the older Volkssturm soldiers, this was the final stand of their generation, the last chance to prove that Germany could still defend itself. They would make the Americans pay for every bunker, not because Hitler ordered it or because they believed in final victory, but because surrender meant occupation, defeat, shame, and the vindication of everything the Nazis had called impossible. The Hollow Line would fight not because it was strong, but because the men inside it had nowhere left to retreat. September 12, 1944, 06:45 hours. Captain John Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment watched dawn break over the German border near Eilendorf, a small town on the approaches to Aachen. His company had orders to probe the Schill Line, the outer belt of the Westwall's defences, protecting the ancient city that had once been Charlemagne's capital. Intelligence reports, based on air reconnaissance and the optimistic assumptions that had carried Allied forces across France, suggested light resistance. What happened in the next 3 hours would shatter those assumptions and set the pattern for 6 months of brutal combat. The first indication of trouble came when his lead platoon reached a line of dragon's teeth and machine gun fire opened from positions that aerial photographs had identified as abandoned. 3 men went down in the first burst. The rest of the platoon dropped into a drainage ditch that turned out to be in the kill zone of 2 more bunkers. Dawson's war had just become medieval. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, was one of the most experienced units in the American Army. They had landed in North Africa in 1942, fought through Sicily, and stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day. If any unit was prepared for the Westwall, it should have been them, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the specific challenges of bunker warfare. Mobile combat rewarded speed, initiative, and aggressive movement. Fortification assault required patience, coordination, and a willingness to sacrifice time and men for incremental gains. The tactics that had worked brilliantly in the race across France became suicidal against concrete walls 3 meters thick. Early assaults followed the doctrine developed for pillbox attacks in the Pacific. Infantry would advance under covering fire from tanks, suppress the bunker with machine guns and rifle fire, then close with demolitions or flamethrowers. Against wooden and log bunkers or thin concrete, this worked. Against Westwall bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, it produced casualties without results. September 16th brought the first of many hard lessons. Engineers had brought forward a Sherman tank equipped with a 75mm gun, and the plan was to use it in a direct fire role against a particularly troublesome bunker that had already killed 2 men and wounded 5 more. The tank positioned itself at 300 yards range, a distance considered close enough for accuracy but far enough for safety. The gunner fired 6 rounds, all aimed at the bunker's main firing port. American infantry, watching through field glasses, saw the shells strike home, raising dust and fragments from the concrete face. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was undamaged except for cosmetic scarring. The machine gun inside resumed firing, and one of the rounds struck the Sherman's turret with a clang that echoed across the battlefield. The tankers had discovered what engineers would later confirm: 75mm high-explosive shells lacked the penetrative power to crack these structures. Direct hits merely chipped the surface. The bunkers had been designed to resist French artillery, which used larger calibers than American tank guns. Cracking them would require heavy artillery and direct fire rolls, a tactic that put expensive guns at risk from enemy fire. The breakthrough both literal and tactical, came on September 18th. Combat engineers, working with infantry officers who were learning through bloody trial and error, developed the first version of what would become standard operating procedure for Westwall assault. The key insight was that bunkers had to be blinded, flanked, and demolished in sequence. Suppression alone achieved nothing. The thick concrete absorbed fire, and the defenders inside could wait out any bombardment. Instead, infantry and tanks would lay down sustained fire on the bunker's firing ports, not to penetrate but to force the defenders to take cover. While they were suppressed, other infantry would work around to the bunker's flanks and rear, exploiting blind spots in the firing port design. Once in position, engineers would use satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, or flamethrowers against the bunker's entrance or ventilation shafts. The concrete might be nearly invincible, but doors, hatches, and air vents were vulnerable. Pump burning gasoline or explosives into the ventilation system, and even the most determined defenders had to surrender or die. The first successful application of this technique took 8 hours to clear a single bunker complex that covered perhaps 400 square meters. By September 21st, refined through desperate necessity, the time had dropped to 4 to 6 hours depending on the strength of resistance and the terrain, but time translated directly into casualties and exhaustion. Each bunker complex required a full platoon of infantry for suppression, a squad of engineers for demolition, and tank support if available. Losses averaged 10 to 15% of the assault force per complex, sometimes higher if the Germans had prepared properly or if American coordination broke down. Multiply those figures across dozens of bunker complexes protecting the approaches to Aachen, and the arithmetic of attrition became brutally clear. Taking the outer defences alone would cost hundreds of casualties, and the outer defences were supposedly the weakest part of the Westwall system. German defenders quickly learned to exploit American tactical patterns. Once they recognized that Americans were using suppression flank demolish tactics, they adapted their own responses. Some bunkers were connected by underground tunnels, allowing defenders to retreat when assault teams approached, only to reoccupy after the Americans moved on. Others had been modified with additional firing ports covering the rear and flanks, turning supposedly safe approaches into kill zones. The Germans also began using mobile tactics within the static framework. Small teams with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons would wait in covered positions near bunkers, allowing American tanks to approach close for direct fire, then ambush them from unexpected angles. On September 19th, a German counterattack exploited exactly this tactic, catching American forces in the open between captured bunkers and bunkers still fighting, inflicting over 100 casualties and recapturing 2 positions that had cost 30 men to take in the first place. Colonel Gerhard Wilk, the German commander of the Aachen garrison, understood perfectly well that he couldn't win this battle in any conventional sense. His forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from meaningful reinforcement, but winning wasn't the mission. The mission was to make the Americans pay such a high price for Aachen that their offensive would bog down, that their supply lines would strain, that their soldiers would lose the aggressive confidence that had carried them across France. Every day he held was a victory. Every American casualty was a success. Every bunker that required hours to clear was a small triumph. He rotated his defenders carefully, pulling exhausted men back to rest while fresher troops took over threatened positions. He hoarded his limited artillery ammunition for the most critical moments, then fired sudden barrages that disrupted American preparations and forced them to start planning all over again. Most importantly, he managed the morale of his mixed garrison of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and party fanatics, keeping them focused on immediate tactical goals rather than the inevitable strategic outcome. By September 21st, the 1st Infantry Division had penetrated the first belt of bunkers protecting Aachen's southern approaches. They had advanced roughly 2 miles in 9 days. Their casualties exceeded 300 killed and wounded. German losses were harder to calculate but appeared lighter, despite the defenders fighting from positions that were sometimes overrun. The arithmetic troubled American commanders at every level. If this was the cost for the outer defences of one city, what would it cost to break through the entire Westwall? How many divisions would it take? How long would it take? Most troubling of all, the weather was beginning to turn. September rains that had been occasional were becoming frequent, and mud was starting to form in the low-lying areas where much of the fighting occurred. American soldiers, accustomed to the relatively dry summer campaign in France, were getting their first taste of the conditions that would define the Westwall campaign: concrete, mud, and attrition. The fighting around Aachen in mid-September established patterns that would repeat across the entire Westwall front. Individual bunkers, which had seemed so formidable at first encounter, could be defeated with proper tactics, coordination, and willingness to accept casualties. But the sheer number of bunkers, the depth of the defensive system, and the determination of the defenders transformed tactical victories into strategic stalemates. For every bunker cleared, two more revealed themselves. For every position overrun, the Germans established a new line slightly farther back. The concrete fortifications that Hitler had built to deter France in 1938 were finally fulfilling their purpose 6 years later, but in a way nobody had predicted, not by stopping an attack, but by slowing it down so much that stopping and slowing became virtually indistinguishable. Captain Dawson, watching his depleted company dig in that night in positions they had paid for with friends' lives, understood what the generals were only beginning to accept. This was not going to be over by Christmas. This was going to be a long, hard winter of small gains and heavy costs. The Ghost Wall had teeth after all. September 24th, 1944. Lieutenant Howard Randall, a combat engineer with the 1st Infantry Division, stood in front of a captured bunker, giving an informal class to a group of infantry officers who had lost too many men trying to do his job for him. On the bunker's scarred concrete face, he had drawn diagrams with white chalk showing firing port angles, blind spots, and the structural weak points that 18 months of European combat had taught him to recognize. The officers, some of them senior captains with 3 years of combat experience, listened with the focused attention of men who had just learned that their expertise had limits. Randall's main point was simple but revolutionary for men trained in mobile warfare. Stop thinking of these as buildings you can shoot through. Start thinking of them as safes you have to crack. You don't shoot a safe open, you find where it's weak and exploit that. This impromptu lesson, repeated in various forms across the entire front, represented the beginning of a tactical revolution driven by necessity and paid for in casualties. The American Army in September 1944 was the most technologically advanced military force in human history. But it had been designed and trained for a specific type of warfare that the Westwall rendered obsolete. The doctrinal emphasis on speed, mobility, and aggressive maneuver had worked brilliantly from Normandy to the German border. Tank infantry teams had overrun German defensive positions by bypassing strong points and exploiting breakthroughs. Artillery had been used in rolling barrages and counter-battery fire rather than systematic destruction of fortified positions. The supply system prioritized fuel and ammunition for mobile operations rather than the specialized equipment needed for siege warfare. Now, in a matter of days, this entire system had to adapt or accept casualties that would make the campaign unsustainable. The adaptation happened not through careful staff planning in rear area headquarters, but through desperate innovation by frontline soldiers who were literally dying from their own doctrine's inadequacy. The first major innovation emerged almost by accident on September 26th. A Sherman tank, commanded by Sergeant Robert Chen, had been providing suppressive fire on a bunker when its main gun jammed. Rather than retreat for repairs, Chen ordered his driver to approach the bunker directly, then positioned the tank so its bulk blocked the bunker's main firing port. The German defenders, unable to depress their machine guns sufficiently to engage the tank at such close range, found themselves effectively blinded, while the tank sat there, its weight settling into the soft ground. Infantry and engineers approached from the flanks and cleared the position in under an hour with minimal casualties. The tactic was risky, putting the tank in a position where German anti-tank teams could potentially destroy it, but it worked. Within days, tank commanders across the front were using similar blocking tactics, and infantry officers were requesting tank support specifically for this purpose rather than for fire support. The blowtorch and corkscrew method, as soldiers began calling it, formalized the combination of suppression, approach, and demolition into a repeatable procedure. The blowtorch was typically a flamethrower team, though the term came to describe any weapon system that could project fire or explosives into a bunker's interior through firing ports or ventilation shafts. The corkscrew was the systematic approach: suppress to blind, move to flanks, identify entry points, demolish or burn the defenders out. Combat engineer platoons developed specialized equipment loads, pole charges that could be extended to place demolitions against bunker walls without exposing the engineer to direct fire. Bangalore torpedoes, adapted for use against reinforced doors rather than wire obstacles, and thermite grenades that burn hot enough to make bunker interiors uninhabitable. By early October, every infantry battalion attacking Westwall positions included at least one full engineer platoon, compared to the pre-campaign norm of engineer support being centralised at division level. Artillery tactics evolved with equal urgency. The standard American heavy artillery piece, the 155mm gun, proved capable of damaging bunkers if used in direct fire at close range, but this put the guns at risk from counter-battery fire and required them to operate far forward of their normal positions. The compromise solution was the M12 gun motor carriage, a self-propelled mount carrying a 155mm gun on a modified tank chassis. These vehicles could accompany assault forces, deliver direct fire against specific bunkers, and withdraw if threatened. By late September, division commanders were requesting M12s specifically for Westwall operations, and production priorities shifted to accommodate these requests. The casualty figures told the story. In early September, clearing a typical bunker complex cost an average of 12 casualties. By early October, using evolved tactics and specialised equipment, the average had dropped to 7. The difference represented lives saved through learning. The adaptation wasn't purely technical, it required changes in unit organisation and training. Infantry companies formed specialised assault teams, typically 10 to 15 men drawn from the most experienced soldiers, trained specifically for bunker clearance. These teams developed their own tactical language and procedures. The knocker, who placed initial demolitions, the feeder, who passed equipment forward, the watcher, who observed for German reinforcements, while the team was focused on the bunker. Support weapons were reorganised around bunker assault rather than general combat. More flamethrowers and demolitions, fewer mortars and heavy machine guns. Even medical procedures changed. Medics learned to treat the specific types of injuries bunker fighting produced, including burns from flamethrowers used in confined spaces, crush injuries from collapsing concrete, and the psychological trauma of fighting in dark, close quarters where every shadow might hide an enemy. German defenders noticed these tactical changes and struggled to develop countermeasures with far fewer resources than their opponents. Unable to reinforce their concrete structures or significantly improve their weapons, they focused on tactical deception and fighting techniques that exploited the bunker's interconnected nature. False bunkers became common, positions that looked occupied from aerial reconnaissance but were actually abandoned or only lightly defended, designed to draw American assault forces into kill zones covered by real positions. Defenders learned to hold fire longer, allowing American forces to approach close before opening fire at ranges where suppression was less effective. Some positions were rigged with demolitions, set to collapse on assault teams once they breached the entrance. Most effectively, German commanders used their limited mobile reserves to counterattack captured positions before Americans could consolidate, forcing them to clear the same bunkers multiple times. By mid-October, the tactical arms race had reached a temporary equilibrium. Americans could clear individual bunker complexes with reasonable efficiency and acceptable casualties when they used proper procedures, concentrated sufficient resources, and maintained coordination between infantry, engineers, armour, and artillery. Germans could inflict maximum casualties by defending intelligently, using mobility within a static framework, and counter-attacking captured positions before they could be secured. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Americans were learning faster than Germans could adapt, but the sheer number of bunkers meant that even efficient clearing tactics produced slow gains. The mathematics of attrition favoured the defenders despite their overall weakness, because every mile of advance required dozens of bunker clearances, and even with reduced casualties, those clearances added up. The human cost of this learning process cannot be reduced to statistics and tactical diagrams. Every innovation represented lessons bought with lives, every procedure refined through the experience of what happened when the previous version failed. Combat engineers, who had been specialised support troops before the Westwall, became the most critical soldiers in the infantry division. Their casualty rates exceeded infantry rates by significant margins because their work required approaching bunkers at close range, often under direct fire, and placing demolitions that didn't always detonate as planned. A combat engineer in October 1944 had a life expectancy in days, not weeks, when actively engaged in bunker clearance. The survivors developed a grim fatalism and a dark humour about their work. referring to themselves as the cork pullers or concrete specialists, while privately acknowledging that each bunker might be their last. Lieutenant Randall's informal chalk talk lesson in late September had been motivated by exhaustion and frustration, a desperate attempt to prevent infantry officers from wasting men on tactics that couldn't work. By October, such lessons had been formalized into training courses run in rear areas, where combat veterans taught replacement officers and enlisted men the procedures that experience had validated. The American Army was learning, adapting, and systematizing knowledge faster than any military in history. But learning had a price. Adaptation required time, and systematizing knowledge couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic. 18,000 bunkers stretched across the Westwall, and even clearing them efficiently would take months. The tactical evolution that seemed so promising in early October was a necessary but insufficient solution to a strategic problem that had no good answers. The concrete would crack eventually, but slowly, and the men doing the cracking would pay for every metre gained. October 2nd, 1944, Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann of the 347th Volksgrenadier Division stood in front of 43 men who ranged in age from 56 to 44, holding a single K-98 rifle that would have to be shared among them for training. He had been given 3 days to transform these shopkeepers, farmers, and factory workers into bunker defenders, 3 days to teach them skills that regular infantry spent months learning. The men watched him with expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed terror. Most of them had served in the First World War, fighting in trenches that their teenage sons now rotated in Russian mass graves. They knew what modern war meant, and they knew that the concrete bunker they could see through the training field's morning mist offered protection their fathers never had, but also represented a trap from which there might be no escape. Hoffmann, who had lost his left arm at Kursk and been reassigned to training duty, understood his task's absurdity but also its desperate necessity. These men were all Germany had left. The Volksgrenadier program represented Germany's attempt to create new divisions from increasingly limited manpower pools. The name meant People's Infantry, a propaganda term designed to evoke the levée en masse that had saved revolutionary France. But the reality was far less inspiring. Most Volksgrenadier divisions formed in late 1944 consisted of 3 groups: recovered, wounded, like Hoffmann, who were no longer fit for mobile warfare but could still fight from static positions; older men conscripted from reserved occupations that had previously exempted them from service; and very young men from the class of 1926 who would have been in secondary school in peacetime. Equipment shortages meant most Volksgrenadier divisions had only 60 to 70% of their authorized weapons, and what they did have was often captured material from a dozen different nations: French rifles, Czech machine guns, Italian pistols, Russian anti-tank guns. Training typically lasted 3 to 6 weeks instead of the 3 to 6 months that regular Wehrmacht training required. The 347th was assigned to defend a 12-kilometre sector of the Westwall near Monschau, a sector that intelligence suggested the Americans might probe but probably wouldn't attack in force. The division's defensive plan, such as it was, required manning approximately 60 bunkers and creating a mobile reserve of perhaps 200 men who could respond to breakthroughs. With an actual strength of about 5,000 men instead of the theoretical 10,000, this meant most bunkers would have crews of 6 to 8 men instead of the designed 12 to 15. Hoffmann's training platoon would man 3 adjacent bunkers, meaning his 43 students would become 3 crews of roughly 14 men each once they received the few additional soldiers promised from other training cycles. They would have 10 days from the end of training until the Americans were expected to reach their sector. It wasn't enough time, but time was a luxury Germany no longer had. October 5th brought an inspection that revealed how desperate the improvisation had become. A Wehrmacht engineering officer arrived to assess the defensive positions and found conditions that horrified his professional sensibilities, even as he understood their inevitability. The bunkers themselves were structurally sound, but 4 years of neglect meant equipment failures throughout the complex. Ventilation systems didn't work properly, forcing crews to choose between stale air and opening hatches that made them vulnerable. Firing ports had been modified repeatedly, and some no longer aligned with their weapon mounts. Underground tunnels connecting bunkers had flooded, and pumping them out required equipment the division didn't have. Most critically, the approaches to the bunkers lacked proper anti-tank obstacles. The dragon's teeth had been removed or damaged by farmers, and there wasn't enough concrete or time to replace them. Instead, engineers improvised using whatever materials they could requisition. Railroad ties welded together to form crude barriers, farm equipment positioned to block obvious approach routes, even a few disabled vehicles towed into position and camouflaged. The forced labour dimension of the Westwall's reactivation is one of the campaign's darker aspects. With German workers needed for weapons production and military service, much of the physical labour for preparing defences fell to slave workers from concentration camps, prisoners of war who technically should have been protected from combat-related labour, and local civilians conscripted under threat of imprisonment or worse. These workers dug supplementary trenches, connecting bunker systems, cleared fields of fire, transported supplies, and performed the endless manual labour that defensive preparation required. They worked under guard, often inadequately fed, and were punished severely for any perceived sabotage or slowness. Some German officers protested this system on both moral and practical grounds, arguing that forced labour produced poor work and that obvious mistreatment of civilians would motivate resistance. They were overruled by party officials who insisted that total war required total mobilisation regardless of legal or moral niceties. October 7th's diary entry from Sergeant Hoffman captures the resource constraints that define German defence. Ammunition allocation today: 10 rifle rounds per man per day. Machine guns: 100 rounds per gun per day. This is supposed to stop an American division. I have told the men not to fire unless they can see individual faces. Save ammunition for when it matters. We have no artillery support except for emergencies. No air support, obviously. The Americans can call down thunder from heaven whenever they want. We have 10 bullets per man per day and orders to hold forever. The ammunition shortage reflected Germany's larger industrial collapse under Allied bombing and the desperate priorities of a military fighting on multiple fronts with diminishing resources. Artillery ammunition particularly had been rationed to 1/3 of optimal defensive requirements, meaning German guns would fire only when attack was imminent rather than conducting the harassing fire and counter-battery work that proper defence required. The command structure defending the Westwall in October 1944 was as improvised as everything else. Wehrmacht officers like Hoffman understood professional military standards, but increasingly operated under constraints imposed by Nazi Party officials who controlled civilian resources and who held authority to execute anyone deemed defeatist. Gauleiter, the Nazi Party regional leaders, often countermanded military orders they considered insufficiently aggressive. In some sectors, this created genuine defensive improvements, as party officials mobilized resources that military channels couldn't access. In other sectors, it produced chaos, conflicting orders from party and military authorities, resources hoarded by local officials rather than distributed to need, and an atmosphere of terror that motivated compliance through fear rather than leadership. Officers requesting permission to withdraw from untenable positions risked being accused of defeatism, a capital offence under regulations Hitler had imposed after the July assassination attempt. The tactical adaptations that made German defence effective despite resource constraints centred on mobility within a static framework. Bunkers were not defended by fixed crews waiting passively for attack. Instead, small mobile teams would cycle through positions, manning bunkers when attack threatened and withdrawing to covered positions when American artillery preparation began. This technique required good communications and disciplined troops who could move under fire, both of which were increasingly rare, but where it worked, it produced disproportionate results. Americans would conduct extensive artillery preparation, send assault teams forward, and discover bunkers less heavily defended than expected because the Germans had pulled back. Once the Americans committed to clearing the position, German reserves would counterattack, inflicting casualties and forcing the Americans to fight for the same positions multiple times. It was exhausting for defenders and required constant movement that older Volksgrenadier troops found difficult, but it multiplied the effectiveness of limited forces. False positions became a German specialty by mid-October. Engineers and infantry would prepare bunkers that looked occupied, camouflage that appeared recently refreshed, firing ports that seemed active, even dummy weapons visible through binoculars. These positions would draw American attention, artillery fire, and assault preparations, wasting resources and time, while real defensive positions remained undetected. Some false positions were rigged with demolitions, exploding when American engineers breached them. Others were actually occupied by small sniper teams who would fire a few shots, then withdraw, making the position seem more important than it was. The tactic exploited American thoroughness. Their doctrine required clearing every position systematically, and they struggled to distinguish between positions that needed to be fought for and positions that could be bypassed. By mid-October, German commanders holding the Westwall understood several uncomfortable truths. They could not win this battle in any meaningful sense. American material superiority meant they could eventually crack any position through sheer weight of firepower. German reinforcements were not coming. Every available division was committed to the Eastern Front or to Hitler's secret preparations for an Ardennes counteroffensive. Ammunition and supplies would only diminish as the Allied air campaign continued to shatter German logistics. The soldiers defending the line were increasingly old men, wounded men, and boys, supported by inadequate equipment and led by orders that demanded miracles. Yet they also understood that surrender meant occupation, that defeat meant the end of Germany as they knew it, and that every day they held was one more day that something might change, that some negotiated peace might emerge, that final catastrophe might somehow be avoided. Sergeant Hoffman's training platoon moved into their assigned bunkers on October 15th, just as American forces were intensifying their probes of the Monschau sector. His final instruction to the men reflected both the desperation and the determination that characterized German defense. Remember that the concrete protects you. The Americans have to come to you. You don't have to go to them. Fire only when you can hit. Conserve ammunition like it's your own blood, because it might save your blood. If they break through, fall back to the next position. This is not Stalingrad. We're not dying for a flag on a building. We're making them pay for every meter of German soil. That's the mission. Make them pay until they don't want to pay anymore. It was not the speech of a man expecting victory, but it was the speech of a man who would fight anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable and because the concrete walls around him offered an illusion of protection that men in his situation desperately needed to believe. The hollow line would defend itself not through strength but through the accumulated weight of desperation, improvisation, and the terrible arithmetic of attrition that favoured any defence, however flawed, over any attack, however powerful. November 16th, 1944, 06:45 hours. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 4th Infantry Division, huddled in a foxhole near Schevenhutter, listening to a sound he had never heard before and would never forget, the approaching roar of over 2,000 Allied bombers converging on the Westwall defences. The sky had been dark moments before, but now it was filling with aircraft stacked at different altitudes, their engines creating a vibration that could be felt through the ground. Mitchell and his squad had been briefed that this was the largest air bombardment ever attempted against field fortifications, that the concrete bunkers that had resisted tank guns and artillery would be obliterated, that their infantry assault would essentially be a mopping-up operation through the rubble. Around him, replacements too young to know better believed it. Veterans like Mitchell, who had seen what bombs did and didn't do in Normandy, kept their skepticism private and checked their ammunition one more time. Operation Queen represented the Allied answer to the Westwall problem. Overwhelming force concentrated against a narrow sector to achieve breakthrough through sheer destruction. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, had designed the operation around a massive air attack followed by artillery preparation and then infantry armour assault by 12 divisions. The target was the Roar River crossings, objectives approximately 25 miles beyond the current front lines. Success would breach the West Wall completely in this sector, cross the Roar, and potentially position American forces for a Rhine crossing before winter. The scale of the operation reflected both Allied confidence in material superiority and Allied frustration with the slow progress of the previous 2 months. If bunkers couldn't be cleared one by one efficiently enough, perhaps they could simply be destroyed wholesale by air power that Germany couldn't match. The bombing began at 06:45 and continued for nearly 3 hours. 1,191 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force dropped their loads on German positions, followed by 1,023 medium bombers from the 9th Air Force attacking tactical targets. The tonnage exceeded 10,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, concentrated in a zone roughly 15 kilometres wide and 5 kilometres deep. From rear observation posts, the spectacle was apocalyptic. Entire forests disappeared in expanding clouds of smoke and dust. The ground rippled with overlapping explosions, and the sound was literally deafening. damaging eardrums of men watching from miles away. This was industrial warfare at its most terrible, the accumulated destructive power of American industry unleashed in a single morning. Surely nothing could survive it. At 12:45 hours, the infantry advanced through landscape transformed into something from another planet. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to splinters. Roads had disappeared under cratering. Villages marked on maps no longer existed above ground level. The smell of explosive residue mixed with pulverized concrete and burning wood created a haze that reduced visibility to meters. Mitchell's squad moved forward carefully, expecting to find dazed German survivors or simply piles of rubble marking where bunkers had stood. Instead, they encountered something that shouldn't have been possible: machine gun fire from positions that should have been obliterated. The bombing had missed. Not entirely, not everywhere, but enough. Bunkers whose exact locations had been marked on targeting maps remained structurally intact, their thick concrete and buried construction making them resistant to anything except direct hits by the heaviest bombs. And direct hits against small targets hidden in forested terrain proved rare even with 2,000 bombers. The failure of the air attack to destroy the fortifications derived from multiple factors that would later be analysed in painful detail. Altitude requirements for heavy bombers meant accuracy suffered. Bombs intended for specific bunkers often landed hundreds of meters away. The camouflage and forested terrain that made bunkers hard to spot from the ground made them nearly impossible to target from 20,000 feet through cloud cover and smoke. Some bombardiers, aware that American troops would be advancing through areas they bombed, deliberately aimed long to avoid short bombing incidents, inadvertently sparing German positions. Most fundamentally, the bunker design itself, with its reinforced concrete roof buried under meters of earth, proved remarkably resistant to bombs that detonated on the surface. The blast and fragmentation effects that would devastate surface targets dissipated into the air, while the concrete absorbed compression stress that would crack normal buildings. A post-battle analysis estimated that only 15% of bunkers in the target zone sustained serious damage from the aerial bombardment, far below the 50 to 75% destruction that planners had assumed. November 21st brought the first significant success of Operation Queen, the 2nd Armoured Division's breakthrough near Geilenkirchen. Using tactics refined over the previous 2 months, combined tank infantry engineer teams pushed through the stunned but surviving German defences, advancing 5 miles in 36 hours. This represented the deepest penetration of the Westwall achieved to date, and for a brief period, it seemed the breakthrough was developing as planned. But the advance revealed another problem. Beyond the first belt of bunkers lay second and third belts, less dense, but still formidable, and German reserves were rushing to seal the breach faster than American forces could exploit it. The breakthrough became a salient, a bulge in the front line that was vulnerable from 3 sides, requiring more troops to defend than had taken it in the first place. By November 24th, the 2nd Armoured had been fought to exhaustion, having advanced brilliantly but unsustainably. The Hürtgen forest, the dark maze of conifers that dominated the southern portion of Operation Queen's objective area, became synonymous with everything that went wrong with the offensive. The 28th Infantry Division attacked into the forest on November 16th, tasked with clearing the fortified towns of Schmidt and Commerscheid. What followed was nightmare combat that combined the worst aspects of First World War trench fighting with modern weaponry. Tree bursts, artillery shells detonating in the forest canopy and showering defenders with wooden shrapnel and shell fragments created casualty rates far exceeding those in open terrain. Bunkers concealed among trees were invisible until point-blank range. The thick forest canopy defeated American air superiority, preventing close air support that might have compensated for artillery's reduced effectiveness. Within a week, the 28th Infantry Division had been shattered, suffering over 6,000 casualties for gains measured in hundreds of meters. They would be pulled from the line and reconstituted, the first of several divisions that would be destroyed and rebuilt in the Hürtgen's deadly embrace. The weather became an active enemy as November progressed. Rain that had been occasional in September became constant, turning unpaved roads into mud traps and foxholes into flooded pits. The Ruhr River and its tributaries, normally minor obstacles, swelled with runoff until they became genuine barriers requiring engineer support to cross. Mud-clogged weapons made movement exhausting and turned supply operations into nightmares as trucks bogged down miles from the front and critical supplies had to be man-carried forward. Worst of all, the cold November rain combined with inadequate winter clothing to produce an epidemic of trench foot a condition where prolonged exposure to cold and wet causes tissue damage that can require amputation. By late November, non-battle casualties from exposure and illness were approaching battle casualties from combat, a ratio that hadn't been seen in the American army since the Civil War. German defenders, though pressed desperately hard, managed to prevent the collapse that Operation Queen had been designed to achieve. They gave ground grudgingly, counterattacked when possible, and exploited every American mistake. Their casualties were severe, perhaps higher than American casualties in pure numbers, but their defensive mission required only holding, not attacking, and the concrete bunkers that survived the bombing provided islands of protection in the artillery-ravaged landscape. German commanders rotated exhausted units out of the line when possible, brought in limited reinforcements from training depots, and above all, maintained the kind of flexible defense that turned every copse of trees and every ruined village into a miniature fortress. They were losing, but slowly enough that losing and holding became indistinguishable. By December 10th, when Operation Queen was effectively over, though not officially terminated, American forces had advanced roughly 25 miles in some sectors, less than 10 in others, at a cost of approximately 28,000 casualties. They had reached the Roar River in several places, but had not crossed it in strength, had not broken through the Westwall completely, and had not achieved the decisive victory that the massive initial bombardment had promised. The Germans had suffered perhaps 20 to 25,000 casualties, had lost significant territory, but had not collapsed, had not retreated beyond the Rhine, and still held organised defensive positions. The arithmetic of attrition, which should have favoured the side with superior resources, was producing something closer to stalemate because concrete and terrain multiplied defensive effectiveness beyond what material calculations suggested was possible. The lessons of Operation Queen would be debated for decades. Advocates argued that without the offensive, German forces might have launched their own attack from stronger positions. Critics pointed out that the same resources expended more carefully might have achieved better results with fewer casualties. Everyone agreed that the air bombardment had failed to achieve its objectives and that future operations needed to accept that concrete fortifications required ground assault regardless of how much ordnance was dropped on them from above. For the soldiers who fought through November's cold rain and German resistance, the lessons were simpler and darker. The Westwall was going to be broken bunker by bunker, that this would cost thousands of lives, and that it would take far longer than anyone had predicted in the optimistic days of September. The big push had pushed hard and gained ground, but it hadn't broken through, and now winter was coming with all its additional horrors. The concrete stood, the Germans still fought, and the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas would now be spent in frozen foxholes, facing bunkers that bombs couldn't destroy, and determination that attrition couldn't eliminate. December 1st, 1944. Captain Donald Price of the Army Corps of Engineers stood inside a captured bunker near Stolberg, examining damage from a 500-pound bomb that had struck the structure almost directly during Operation Queen's massive bombardment. The crater outside had been 6 meters deep and 12 meters across, a testament to the explosive force. The bunker itself, by all reasonable engineering expectations, should have been rubble. Instead, Price was standing in an intact concrete chamber where the only damage was a network of cracks radiating from the impact point on the roof, none deeper than 30 centimeters into concrete that was 2 meters thick. His measuring equipment and the concrete sample he was carefully extracting would help answer the question that was haunting Allied planners. Why were these bunkers so much harder to destroy than engineering calculations suggested they should be? The systematic study of Westwall fortifications began in late November as American forces captured enough intact bunkers to permit detailed analysis. Engineers had been examining individual structures throughout the campaign, but now the Army wanted comprehensive data. What made these bunkers so resistant? Were there patterns to their strength? And most importantly, were there vulnerabilities that could be exploited more efficiently than the current bunker-by-bunker grinding assault? Teams of engineers, some with civilian structural engineering experience, were assigned to examine bunkers in detail, take measurements, test concrete samples in field laboratories, and compile reports that combined hard science with battlefield observation. What they discovered was a story of both brilliant engineering and penny-wise, pound-foolish construction that explained everything about the Westwall's paradoxical nature. The concrete itself was the key to both the fortifications' strength and their weaknesses. German engineers in the late 1930s had developed a concrete mixture using aggregate stones from local quarries, creating a composite material with exceptional compression strength. When bombs struck, the force dissipated through this aggregate matrix instead of shattering the concrete as would happen with lower quality mixtures. Laboratory tests showed that the best Westwall concrete had compression strength approaching 50 megapascals, comparable to modern high-grade structural concrete and far exceeding the 20 to 30 megapascal strength of typical military construction. This explained why shells and bombs that should have penetrated simply bounced off or created only surface damage. The bunkers weren't thick enough to stop everything through mass alone. They were strong enough that mass and quality combined created near imperviousness to anything except direct hits by the heaviest weapons. But the rushed 1938 construction had created wild inconsistency that engineers found when they tested multiple samples from different bunkers. Some structures showed the 50 megapascal strength that made them nearly indestructible. Others tested at 25 to 30 megapascals, still strong but vulnerable to sustained bombardment. A few particularly poor examples came in below 20 megapascals, meaning they were weaker than many civilian buildings. The variation correlated directly with construction timing. Bunkers built in 1936 and 37, during the initial careful phase, showed consistently high quality. Bunkers rushed to completion during the Munich crisis of September-October 1938 showed dramatic quality variation, sometimes within a single structure where different pours of concrete had cured differently. The political pressure to meet Hitler's deadline had produced exactly what engineers had warned against: structures that looked identical but performed wildly differently under stress. The steel reinforcement told an even more troubling story from the German perspective. Cost-cutting during construction had led to reinforcement bar placement that maximized coverage while minimizing material use. This meant bars were often too close to the concrete surface, where moisture could penetrate through microcracks and cause corrosion. Engineers examining bunkers found extensive rust on reinforcement bars in structures less than 10 years old, rust that weakened the concrete-steel bond and reduced overall structural strength. In some cases, corroded bars had expanded, creating cracks in the concrete that made the structure vulnerable to explosive damage. The bunkers that American forces found hardest to destroy were often those where luck and careful construction had combined to prevent corrosion, while bunkers that collapsed more easily often showed extensive reinforcement corrosion even though their external appearance suggested equal strength. The architectural design revealed sophistication that Price and his fellow engineers grudgingly admired. The bunkers used a honeycomb internal structure rather than solid concrete masses, creating chambers and walls that distributed blast force through the structure instead of allowing it to concentrate at failure points. When bombs or shells struck, the force radiated through this honeycomb, dissipating energy that might otherwise crack the structure fatally. Firing ports were recessed and angled to prevent direct fire from entering while allowing defenders to cover wide areas. Ventilation systems, when they worked, could be sealed to protect against gas attack and opened to provide air circulation. Entrances were positioned on rear or side faces, protected by chicanes and blast walls that prevented direct fire from penetrating into the bunker's interior. In purely defensive terms, these were brilliantly designed structures that maximized protection while minimizing material use. Yet engineers also identified the vulnerabilities that ground combat had already discovered through bloody experience. The ventilation shafts, essential for keeping bunker crews alive during prolonged occupation, provided access routes for explosives and flamethrower fuel. Doors and hatches, necessarily weaker than solid concrete, could be blown with properly placed charges. The interconnection tunnels that were supposed to allow mutual support between bunkers had mostly flooded or collapsed, turning what should have been coordinated defensive complexes into isolated positions. Most critically, the bunkers had been designed for weapons and tactics of the late 1930s, and their firing ports didn't accommodate the flexibility that modern combined arms assault required. Defenders had limited ability to engage targets that got close to the bunker, creating dead zones that American assault teams learned to exploit. The optimal weapon for bunker destruction, engineers determined through testing, was direct fire artillery at close range, using the heaviest available calibers. The 8-inch howitzer, firing armor-piercing shells at 300 to 500 yards range, could crack even the strongest bunkers after sustained bombardment. The problem was that this tactic put expensive artillery pieces at risk from German counter-battery fire and required moving heavy guns forward to positions where they were vulnerable to infantry attack. The alternative, using aerial bombs or long-range artillery, required prohibitive ammunition expenditure for uncertain results. A typical bunker might absorb 50 to 100 heavy artillery shells before structural failure, and if those shells were fired from safe distances at indirect fire, the number could double or triple. The grinding arithmetic that had defined the campaign was built into the concrete itself. Every bunker could be destroyed, but only by expending resources and time that multiplied across 18,000 bunkers created unsustainable costs. December 15 brought a classified briefing where Captain Price presented his findings to division and corps commanders, trying to explain in tactful terms that there was no easy answer to the Westwall problem. He showed photographs of pristine concrete that had shrugged off direct hits and photographs of crumbling concrete that had failed under modest stress. He explained the role of aggregate quality, curing time, reinforcement placement, and pure construction luck in determining whether a bunker would be easy or hard to destroy. The generals listened with growing frustration because Price's conclusion offered no tactical breakthrough. Some bunkers could be destroyed efficiently, others could not, and there was no reliable way to distinguish between them until you started shooting. The only real solution was to continue doing what they had been doing: systematic assault using combined arms, accepting casualties, and grinding forward regardless of cost. One general, exhausted from watching his division bleed in the Hürtgen forest, asked the question everyone was thinking: if we had known this in September, would we have done anything differently? Price's honest answer was no, because there was no alternative to fighting through the fortifications, and knowing that some bunkers were tougher than others didn't change the fundamental requirement to clear them all. The concrete truth was that Hitler's rush to build the Westwall had created a Frankenstein's monster of defensive engineering. Brilliantly designed structures built with inconsistent quality, creating fortifications that were simultaneously formidable and flawed, durable and decaying, effective and vulnerable. The genius of the design multiplied the impact of limited resources, creating defensive positions that required disproportionate effort to overcome. The flaws in construction created weaknesses that prevented the line from being truly impregnable, ensuring it could be broken given sufficient determination and cost. The result was exactly the kind of fortification that would maximize casualties on both sides, while preventing decisive victory for either. Strong enough to force attackers to pay heavily for every meter, weak enough that breakthrough was always theoretically possible, just beyond the next bunker, just past the next kilometre of Dragon's Teeth, just after the next artillery preparation. The Westwall's concrete had become a monument to the law of unintended consequences, serving purposes its builders never imagined in ways both more and less effective than they had designed. And Captain Price's report, careful and scientific and brutally honest, confirmed what soldiers already knew from carrying their wounded friends back from bunkers that refused to break. This was going to take longer, cost more, and hurt worse than anyone had admitted was possible. October 12, 1944. In a heavily fortified bunker complex near Bad Nauheim, Adolf Hitler presided over a conference so secret that attendees were required to surrender their briefcases and sidearms before entering. The generals gathered around the map table von Rundstedt, model Jodl, listened as Hitler outlined an operation that would reverse Germany's fortunes in the West. A massive armoured offensive through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied armies, capturing Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace before Germany collapsed. The operation would require concentrating virtually every available panzer division, all mobile reserves, and the bulk of Germany's remaining fuel and ammunition reserves. One general, bolder than his colleagues, asked the obvious question: Mein Führer, what about the Westwall? Without these reserves, can we hold? Hitler's response was characteristic: willpower and determination would hold the Westwall. The concrete fortifications made reserves unnecessary. The offensive would succeed, the Allies would sue for peace, and the Westwall would become irrelevant. No one in the room believed this, but no one was willing to say so. The Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last gamble, and its preparation determined everything about the Westwall campaign in ways that neither side fully understood at the time. From late September through early December 1944, while American forces were grinding forward through concrete bunkers at terrible cost, Germany was secretly assembling the strongest force it had fielded since the invasion of Russia. Approximately 30 divisions, including 9 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, supported by what remained of the Luftwaffe's fighters. These forces were being positioned not at the Westwall, where they might have strengthened the defence decisively, but in the Eifel region behind the Ardennes forest, where Hitler planned to achieve strategic surprise by attacking through terrain the Allies considered unsuitable for major offensive operations. Every tank, every artillery piece, every combat-ready battalion that might have made the Westwall genuinely formidable was instead being hoarded for an offensive that had to succeed completely or would fail catastrophically. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the nominal commander of German forces in the West, understood the strategic insanity of the plan but lacked the authority or courage to oppose it effectively. His October situation reports to Berlin painted an increasingly desperate picture. The Westwall garrisons were under strength, poorly equipped, and spread across a 390-mile front that they couldn't possibly defend in depth. He requested 6 divisions as reinforcements. The minimum he calculated was necessary to create a mobile reserve capable of responding to American breakthroughs. He received 2 divisions, both under strength, both composed largely of replacements who had minimal training. The reason was always the same: forces were needed for the upcoming offensive. The defensive mission at the Westwall was to hold with minimum resources while the offensive prepared, then to hold while the offensive succeeded, and then presumably to become irrelevant as the Allies reeled from strategic defeat. It was magical thinking dressed in military planning. The deception succeeded brilliantly in ways that made the strategic failure even worse. Allied intelligence, watching German dispositions carefully, noticed forces being pulled from the Westwall front and assumed they were being fed into defensive positions behind the line or moved to other threatened sectors. They never imagined that Germany was capable of assembling a major offensive force. Every intelligence assessment emphasized German weakness, declining morale, and inevitable collapse. When German reconnaissance units began probing the Ardennes sector in November, American intelligence interpreted this as defensive preparation, perhaps an attempt to forestall an Allied offensive through that region. The massive concentration of forces, cleverly camouflaged and moved primarily at night, went undetected. The Allies expected German reserves to strengthen the Westwall because that's what made sense strategically. The fact that those reserves were being positioned for a counter-offensive never seriously entered American or British calculations. November 15th marked a critical date, visible only in hindsight. The 6th Panzer Army, the strongest force Germany had assembled since Kursk, completed its movement to assembly areas in the Eifel. This represented roughly 150,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns, and artillery support that dwarfed what was available to Westwall defenders. Simultaneously, American forces launched Operation Queen, the massive offensive designed to break through the Westwall and reach the Rohr River. The timing was coincidental but symbolically perfect. The Americans were committing maximum force to break defensive positions that were deliberately being kept weak, while Germany concentrated forces for an offensive that had to succeed before those defensive positions collapsed completely. Both sides were gambling, but Germany's gamble was existential in a way the American gamble was not. The force allocation numbers reveal the scale of Germany's strategic bet. Along the 390-mile Westwall front in mid-November, Germany deployed approximately 18 divisions with an average strength of 5,000 to 6,000 men each, totaling perhaps 100 to 110,000 troops. These forces faced roughly 85 American and British divisions, but the Allies were spread across a broad front and rotating units, in and out of combat, so the immediate frontline strength was perhaps 25 to 30 divisions. The force ratio was unfavourable but not impossible. The defensive positions and terrain could multiply German effectiveness, but concentrated in the Ardennes assembly areas were another 30 divisions, approximately 250,000 men ready for offensive operations. If even a third of those forces had been allocated to strengthening the Westwall defence, the campaign would have been dramatically different. The Americans might have faced organised counterattacks by fresh panzer divisions. Breakthrough attempts might have met mobile reserves capable of sealing penetrations. The concrete bunkers might have been part of a genuine defence in depth rather than sacrificial positions manned by inadequate garrisons. German commanders defending the Westwall knew something was being prepared behind them, but not what or when. They received occasional replacement drafts, always inadequate, and occasional resupply shipments, always insufficient. What they didn't receive were the reinforcements they requested, the artillery support they needed, or the mobile reserves that doctrine required for proper defensive operations. A divisional commander near Aachen, requesting tank support to counterattack an American penetration in late November, was told that forces are not available for this mission. Those forces existed, hundreds of panzers sitting in assembly areas preparing for the Ardennes offensive, but they were unavailable for defensive missions because they were reserved for the offensive that would supposedly make defense unnecessary. The logic was circular and ultimately suicidal. The Westwall had to hold long enough for the offensive to launch, but the offensive had stripped the Westwall of forces needed to hold, meaning the offensive had to succeed quickly before the Westwall collapsed. But the offensive's success was far from guaranteed. December 16th would reveal the full scale of the strategic miscalculation, but through October, November, and early December, the Phantom Reserves haunted the Westwall campaign in the form of reinforcements that were always expected but never arrived, counterattacks that were always planned but never executed, and relief that was always promised but never delivered. German defenders holding bunkers with inadequate weapons and ammunition looked over their shoulders expecting to see panzer columns arriving to restore the front. American commanders attacking those positions expected to encounter mobile reserves counterattacking their penetrations. Both expectations were reasonable based on military logic. Both were wrong because Hitler had made a different calculation. Better to bet everything on one desperate offensive than to distribute forces across defensive missions that only delayed inevitable defeat. The Westwall's defenders were sacrificed to make the Ardennes offensive possible, and when the offensive failed, as it inevitably would, those defenders would have died for nothing, holding concrete boxes that bought time for a gamble that never paid off. The strategic opportunity cost is staggering to contemplate. A Germany that had concentrated its remaining armoured strength at the Westwall, creating mobile reserves capable of aggressive defence, might have extended the campaign by months. American and British forces would have faced not just concrete bunkers but coordinated counterattacks by experienced panzer divisions. Breakthroughs might have been sealed before they could be exploited. The grinding attrition that was slowly favouring the Allies might have become genuinely mutual slaughter that forced negotiation. The war's outcome wouldn't have changed. Germany was doomed by material inferiority and strategic overextension, but the pace and cost of defeat might have been dramatically different. Instead, Hitler chose to gamble on operational brilliance, producing strategic miracle, stripped his defences to enable that gamble, and ensured that when the gamble failed, there would be nothing left with which to conduct even a fighting retreat. The Phantom Reserves existed, were substantial, and were thrown away on an offensive that briefly surprised the Allies but ultimately accelerated Germany's collapse. The men holding bunkers at the Westwall, fighting with inadequate support and watching for relief that never came, paid the price for decisions made in secret conferences where strategic dreams overruled tactical reality. They held because they had no choice, died because they had been abandoned, and in the end achieved nothing except to delay the inevitable by days and weeks that cost thousands of lives but changed nothing about the final outcome. October 13th, 1944, Colonel Gerhard Wilk sat in his command bunker deep beneath Aachen's city centre, reading a radio message that left him no room for interpretation or hope. Hitler's personal order was explicit. Aachen must be held. No withdrawal, no surrender, fight to the last man and the last round. The penalty for disobedience would be execution, not just of Wilk but of his family. The American ultimatum had expired at noon, giving Aachen's defenders one final chance to surrender the city that Charlemagne had made his capital 1100 years earlier. Wilk had written his refusal with full knowledge of what it meant. The next week would see Aachen become the first German city to fall to Allied forces, but only after the Americans had reduced much of it to rubble and paid for every block with blood. He was 41 years old, a professional officer who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He knew the war was lost. He also knew that refusing Hitler's order meant death, and obeying it meant death, so he chose to die doing his duty as he understood it. The Americans had surrounded Aachen by mid-October through a pincer movement that had cost them weeks and thousands of casualties. The 1st Infantry Division attacked from the south, while the 30th Infantry Division pushed from the north, meeting east of the city and completing the encirclement. Inside the trap were approximately 5,000 German defenders, elements of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, fortress troops who had manned Westwall bunkers, police units, and various rear echelon soldiers who had been swept into the defence. The civilians who remained, perhaps 12 to 15,000 out of a pre-war population of 165,000, huddled in cellars and bunkers while the military situation deteriorated around them. The Westwall fortifications that had protected Aachen's approaches had fallen or been bypassed, but now the city itself would become a fortress, every building a bunker, every street a kill zone. October 15th brought American attempts to take the city systematically, using tactics that combined overwhelming firepower with methodical infantry assault. The problem was that Aachen's medieval city centre and 19th century industrial districts created an urban maze far more complex than any fortification line. Buildings that had stood for centuries had thick stone walls that provided natural cover. Cellars and sewers created underground networks that allowed German defenders to move unseen. The dense construction meant American armour couldn't manoeuvre freely, reducing much of the fighting to infantry battles house by house. Most critically, the Americans discovered that their Westwall bunker-busting tactics didn't translate directly to urban combat. You couldn't suppress an entire building the way you could suppress a bunker. You couldn't flank a city block the way you could flank a pillbox. Urban warfare required different skills, different equipment, and above all, different tolerances for collateral damage. The artillery solution was brutal and effective. American commanders, frustrated by slow progress and mounting casualties, began using heavy artillery in direct fire roles at ranges measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. 155mm guns would be wheeled forward, often in the open, aimed at specific buildings holding German defenders, and fired repeatedly until the structure collapsed. The Germans called this earthquake bombing, and it represented industrial-age siege warfare applied to modern cities. A typical engagement might see 10 to 20 shells from a single gun demolish a building that infantry had been unable to clear by assault. The technique saved American lives at the cost of German civilian lives and irreplaceable cultural heritage. Aachen's famous cathedral, where German kings had been crowned for 6 centuries, took multiple hits that damaged but didn't destroy it. Countless lesser buildings simply ceased to exist, reduced to rubble piles that created new obstacles even as they eliminated defensive positions. October 18th marked the battle's grimmest phase. American forces controlled perhaps 40% of the city but faced intensifying resistance as they pushed toward Wilkes' command bunker and the remaining German strongpoints. German defenders, running low on ammunition and supplies but still receiving radio orders demanding continued resistance, fought with the desperation of men who knew they would receive no mercy. They had seen the ultimatums, heard the American promises to reduce the city to rubble if necessary, and understood that surrender meant prison camps in an uncertain future, while resistance at least gave them, the soldiers, illusion of control over their fate. Small groups would hold buildings until walls collapsed around them, then retreat through cellars to the next position. Snipers turned every advance into a lethal lottery. German civilians caught in the middle begged both sides to stop, pleaded with German soldiers to surrender, and watched helplessly as their city died around them. The fighting inside Aachen Cathedral, one of the most sacred sites in German history, symbolized the battle's descent into desperate urban combat, where no place was too holy for violence. German troops had established positions in the cathedral's upper galleries, using medieval architecture as modern defensive positions. American infantry worked their way through the building, room by room, fighting in spaces where emperors had been crowned and where thousands of Germans had prayed for victory in wars, stretching back to Charlemagne's time. Both sides tried to avoid destroying the structure completely, even in total war. Some symbols demanded respect, but bullet-scarred walls that had stood for centuries, and blood-stained stones that had witnessed the full sweep of German history. When American forces finally cleared the cathedral on October 20th, soldiers from both sides felt the weight of what they had made necessary. War so total that even this place, this monument to faith and history, had become just another building to fight through. October 21st, 12:05 hours, Colonel Wilk, surrounded in his command bunker with perhaps 200 soldiers and no possibility of relief, accepted the inevitable and surrendered. American troops descended into the bunker complex to find exhausted men who had fought brilliantly for a lost cause because their orders and their understanding of duty had given them no alternative. The formal surrender document listed 5,600 German prisoners, a number that included garrison troops, Volkssturm defenders, and various soldiers who had been trapped in the encirclement. The actual number of German combat effectives who had defended the city was probably half that figure. The rest were support personnel, wounded men too injured to evacuate, and civilians in uniform who had been swept into the defense. They had held one city for 19 days against an American division that had expected to take it in 3. They had transformed every building into a fortress and every street into a battlefield. And they had lost because concrete and courage, however impressive, couldn't overcome the arithmetic of ammunition, reinforcement, and industrial firepower. The cost shocked both sides. American casualties exceeded 5,000 killed and wounded, a butcher's bill that made Aachen one of the costliest urban battles in American military history to that date. German military casualties were comparable, though exact figures remain disputed because many defenders were buried under rubble or recorded as missing. Perhaps 1,600 German civilians died in the fighting, caught between armies or killed by the bombardment that had become the American solution to German resistance. The city itself bore wounds that would take decades to heal. Approximately 65% of the city centre destroyed. Countless medieval and Renaissance buildings reduced to rubble, infrastructure shattered, and a population traumatized by experiencing modern war at its most intimate and brutal. The propaganda value exceeded the military value for both sides. For the Allies, Aachen's fall represented the first breach not just of the Westwall but of Germany itself. Eisenhower's headquarters proclaimed that German soil had been conquered, that the Reich's borders were no longer inviolate, that the tide of war had permanently turned. American and British newspapers ran photographs of the ruined city with captions emphasizing German defeat and Allied inexorability. The message was clear. If Aachen, ancient capital and symbol of German history, could fall, no city was safe. For Germany, propaganda worked differently. Goebbels used Aachen's resistance as proof that Germans would fight for every metre of homeland, that the Allies would pay such terrible prices for victory that eventually they would tire of the cost. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between these propaganda extremes. Aachen had fallen because it had to fall eventually, but it had cost far more than the Americans had expected and delayed the Westwall campaign by crucial weeks, during which weather deteriorated and German preparations elsewhere continued. The strategic situation after Aachen's fall was paradoxically frustrating for American planners. They had taken the city, breached the Westwall at this point, and demonstrated that German resistance, however fierce, could be overcome. But they hadn't achieved breakthrough. The Westwall positions around Aachen remained contested. German forces still held the line north and south of the city. Most critically, taking Aachen had consumed resources and time that were supposed to be available for exploitation, and now winter was approaching with most of the Westwall still intact and German forces still defending it with determination that suggested they would contest every kilometre as fiercely as they had contested every street in Aachen. The city's fall was a victory, significant militarily and symbolically, but it was also a warning. If every German city had to be taken this way, the campaign into Germany proper would be measured in years and costs that might exhaust even American wealth and patience. For the soldiers who had fought there, Aachen became a reference point for everything that urban combat meant. The exhaustion of fighting in 3 dimensions, the moral weight of destroying a city to save it, the strange intimacy of combat where you could hear your enemy breathing through a wall before you killed him, and the grinding certainty that victory measured in blocks and buildings was victory so expensive it felt almost like defeat. A lieutenant in the 26th Infantry Regiment, riding home after the battle ended, tried to explain what they had experienced. We took Aachen. That's what the newspapers will say. What they won't say is what Aachen took from us. This city died hard, and it made us kill it. And I don't think any of us will ever forget what that felt like. We won. It doesn't feel like we won. It feels like we survived something that should have been avoided, except there was no way to avoid it once it started. Aachen had fallen, the first German city to do so, but the manner of its falling cast a shadow over everything that followed. If this was the price of victory in cities already surrounded and cut off, what would the price be for cities that could still be reinforced, for industrial centres that mattered strategically for Berlin itself? The rubble of Aachen held answers to questions that American commanders didn't want to contemplate but couldn't avoid. The Westwall had been breached at one point, but the campaign was far from over, and now everyone understood exactly how much it would cost to finish what they had started. November 3rd, 1944, Sergeant Robert Chen of the 10th Armoured Division sat in his disabled Sherman tank, filing what would become an official after-action report about a tactic his crew had stumbled onto entirely by accident. They had been supporting an infantry assault on a bunker complex near Übach when the tank's 76mm gun jammed during fire suppression. Unable to complete their mission or safely retreat under German observation, Chen had ordered his driver to approach the bunker directly and position the tank's bulk across the primary firing port. The German machine gunners inside, unable to depress their weapon sufficiently to engage the tank at point-blank range, found themselves suddenly blind. While the Sherman sat there, infantry and engineers moved on the bunker from angles the defenders couldn't cover. The position fell in 40 minutes, with only one American casualty. The technique was dangerous. A German anti-tank team could have destroyed the stationary Sherman, but it worked. Within a week, every tank unit in the sector was using variations of bunker blocking, and German defenders were desperately trying to counter this new American innovation. The Westwall campaign had become an evolutionary arms race, where tactical innovations spawned counter-innovations in cycles that accelerated through late autumn. The Americans had resources to experiment, fail, and try again. They could develop new equipment, distribute it quickly, and train troops to use it. The Germans had experience, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the desperation that makes innovation necessary for survival. Neither side could achieve decisive advantage, but both could force the other to adapt continuously, creating a warfare laboratory where tactics evolved in real time, and soldiers learnt that yesterday's solutions might be today's death traps. This constant evolution exhausted both armies differently. Americans through the cognitive load of learning new systems constantly, Germans through the resource strain of countering innovations they couldn't match materially. November 8th brought German response to American bunker blocking techniques. A Volksgrenadier commander near Hürtgen observed that American tanks positioning themselves against bunker firing ports followed predictable patterns, approaching from specific angles that minimized their exposure to anti-tank fire. He positioned a single Panzerfaust team, 2 men with one-shot anti-tank weapons, in a covered position where they could observe 3 bunkers Americans were likely to attack. When the expected Sherman approached to block a firing port, the team waited until the tank was committed, stationary, and focused entirely on the bunker. The Panzerfaust rounds struck the Sherman's side armor at 50 meters range, penetrating the hull and killing 3 of the 5-man crew. The technique spread rapidly, roving gun tactics, where anti-tank teams moved between positions rather than defending fixed locations, waiting for American tanks to commit to bunker blocking before engaging them from unexpected angles. American tankers called it ambush warfare, and it made them reconsider how aggressively they would position against bunkers. The American counter-adaptation came through combined arms coordination refined to levels approaching choreography. Instead of tanks approaching bunkers alone, assault teams now included infantry, specifically tasked with clearing ambush positions before armor committed. Smoke screens, which had been used sparingly due to supply limitations, became standard for bunker assaults, blinding German observation and making tank positioning less predictable. Tank commanders began using dummy runs, approaching bunkers but withdrawing before fully committing, trying to draw out German anti-tank teams and locate them through their fire. Most effectively, Americans started using multiple tanks in bunker assaults, with one tank blocking the firing port while others positioned to cover likely ambush positions. The complexity increased, the coordination requirements multiplied, but the casualty rates for bunker assaults continued their slow decline from the appalling figures of September. November 20th introduced German infrared night vision equipment to Westwall defensive positions, representing one of the few technological advantages Germany retained. The Zielgerät 1229 vampire scope allowed defenders to see in darkness that blinded American attackers. Approximately 310 of these devices were deployed along the Westwall by December, typically mounted on defensive positions covering likely American approaches. The tactical impact was disproportionate to the numbers. American forces attacking at dawn or dusk, traditional times for infantry assault, suddenly found themselves taking fire from positions that shouldn't have been able to see them. Night attacks, which Americans had used increasingly to minimize German artillery effectiveness, became exercises in fighting an enemy who could see you while you were blind. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers reported feeling exposed and vulnerable, even in darkness that should have protected them. The American response combined low-tech and high-tech solutions. White phosphorus shells, which produced dense white smoke, were found to blind infrared scopes effectively because the devices couldn't distinguish targets through the intense heat and light signature. American artillery officers began adding white phosphorus to their standard bombardment sequences before infantry attacks, not for the smoke's concealment properties but to blind German infrared equipment. More aggressive patrols targeted suspected infrared-equipped positions during daylight, trying to destroy the expensive equipment before night fighting began. Most simply, American forces accepted higher casualties during dawn and dusk attacks and concentrated assaults during full daylight or deep night, time periods where infrared equipment provided less advantage. The equipment remained a problem throughout the campaign, but like so many German innovations in the war's final year, it was too little, too late, deployed in numbers too small to change strategic outcomes. December 5th marked a milestone visible only in statistical abstracts. American forces were clearing bunker complexes in an average of 3.5 hours, down from 6 hours in November and over 8 hours in September. This represented not a single breakthrough, but the accumulated effect of dozens of tactical refinements, better coordination between infantry and engineers, improved artillery targeting procedures, tank tactics that balanced aggressiveness with survivability, and infantry training that had transformed bunker assault from terrifying novelty to routine mission. The casualty cost per bunker cleared had dropped proportionately from 12 killed and wounded in September to 7 in December. Extrapolated across hundreds of bunker assaults, this represented thousands of lives saved through learning. But the absolute numbers remained grim. Clearing the entire Westwall at even the improved December rates would still cost tens of thousands of casualties over months of fighting. German tactical adaptations in this period focused on making bunkers part of larger defensive systems rather than individual strongpoints. The Kampfgruppe system, ad hoc battle groups combining whatever forces were available under flexible command, allowed Germans to mass forces rapidly against American penetrations. A typical Kampfgruppe might consist of 50 to 200 men drawn from multiple units, supported by whatever armor or artillery could be scraped together, operating with maximum tactical flexibility but minimal logistical support. These battle groups would counterattack captured bunker complexes before Americans could consolidate, sometimes recapturing positions multiple times in a single day. The tactic was exhausting and costly for defenders. Counterattacks produced higher casualties than static defense, but it multiplied the effective strength of limited forces by using mobility to compensate for numbers. The false bunker strategy reached sophisticated levels by December. German engineers constructed dummy positions that looked occupied from American observation. Fresh camouflage, visible movement through firing ports, even muzzle flashes from small charges detonated to simulate machine gun fire. These positions drew American artillery fire, consuming ammunition and revealing American attack plans. Some false bunkers were rigged with demolitions, exploding when American engineers breached them. Others contained small teams who would fire a few bursts, then withdraw through hidden exits, making the position seem more heavily defended than it was. American intelligence officers struggled to distinguish between positions that required full assault and positions that could be bypassed, and the result was overcaution that slowed advances and wasted resources on empty concrete. December 12th brought a captured German training manual into American hands, revealing how systematically German defenders were studying and countering American tactics. The manual, dated November 28th, included detailed observations of American bunker assault procedures with recommended countermeasures. Americans rely heavily on suppressive fire before assault, withdraw from threatened bunkers during bombardment, reoccupy when infantry approaches. Americans expect resistance from front-facing positions, position ambush teams on flanks and rear approaches. Americans coordinate infantry tank engineer teams. Target the engineers first to disrupt coordination. The document represented professional military analysis, soldiers learning from opponents and developing doctrine in real time. It also revealed why German defense remained effective despite overwhelming material disadvantage. They were learning too, and sometimes learning faster because survival demanded it. The adaptation cycle created strange dynamics where tactical success didn't translate to strategic progress. Americans were clearing bunkers more efficiently, but Germans were making each cleared bunker less valuable by counterattacking recaptured positions and creating defensive depth that made penetrations less significant. American casualty rates per bunker were dropping, but the Germans were forcing Americans to assault more bunkers by making bypass impossible and withdrawal costly. Neither side could achieve decisive breakthrough. Americans, because German tactical skill multiplied defensive effectiveness beyond what numbers suggested. Germans, because American material superiority eventually overwhelmed any tactical advantage given enough time and ammunition. The result was sophisticated stalemate warfare where both sides demonstrated remarkable tactical competence while making minimal strategic progress. November's weather, cold, wet, miserable, added a non-adaptive enemy that neither side could counter effectively. Mud that slowed everything, cold that caused casualties through exposure, and visibility that favoured defenders who knew the terrain over attackers who were learning it through bloody experience. The adaptation and counter-adaptation would continue through winter, each side refining tactics and developing new techniques, but the fundamental equation remained unchanged. The Westwall could be broken, but slowly, expensively, and only through the kind of attritional warfare that neither side wanted but both seemed unable to avoid. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. Private Daniel Marcus of the 9th Infantry Division huddled in his foxhole near Kalteherberg, trying to make sense of sounds coming from the Ardennes sector to the south. Distant artillery, far heavier than normal, harassing fire, had been rumbling for 30 minutes. Flares arced across the southern horizon, more flares than anyone could remember seeing outside major offensive operations. Then the radio traffic started, fragmentary and confused. German armour attacking in strength, breakthrough at multiple points, entire American divisions cut off. Marcus and his squad had been preparing to assault a bunker complex that morning, continuing the grinding Westwall campaign that had consumed their divisions since September. Now, those orders were suspended, replaced by new instructions that arrived in a frenzy of radio messages. Consolidate defensive positions, prepare for possible German attack from the south, hold current positions until further notice. The Westwall offensive that had been slowly succeeding was about to be interrupted by Germany's last desperate gamble, and nobody on the American side understood what was happening or what it would mean for the concrete bunkers they had been dying to capture for 3 months. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's carefully prepared counterstroke, achieved complete tactical surprise despite multiple intelligence indicators that Allied analysts had missed or misinterpreted. 28 German divisions, including the best equipped and most experienced formations Germany still possessed, attacked through the Ardennes forest where American lines were thinly held by inexperienced or resting divisions. The initial breakthrough was stunning. Within 48 hours, German forces had penetrated 20 to 30 miles in some sectors, surrounded American units at Bastogne and elsewhere, and created a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to split American and British forces. The offensive represented everything Germany had withheld from Westwall defence: fresh divisions, adequate ammunition, fuel for sustained operations, and the tactical skill of veterans who had survived years of warfare. Suddenly, the Westwall fighting that had seemed so important days earlier became secondary to the existential crisis developing in Belgium. December 17th brought orders that reshaped the entire Western Front. American divisions engaged in Westwall fighting would be pulled out and rushed south to contain the German breakthrough. The 1st Infantry Division, which had been fighting continuously since September and had just finished mopping up around Aachen, received movement orders. Elements of the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions, which had been supporting Westwall assaults, were redirected to the Ardennes. The 9th and 90th Infantry Divisions, positioned to continue Operation Queen's push toward the Raw River, went into defensive posture and prepared to counterattack south if necessary. In total, approximately 7 divisions, roughly 90,000 troops that had been grinding through Westwall positions, were pulled away from that mission to address the crisis in the Ardennes. The concrete bunkers that had been costing dozens of casualties per day to capture suddenly became static positions that neither side was actively contesting. The German defenders of the Westwall, who had been fighting desperate rearguard actions for months, suddenly experienced something approaching relief. The American pressure that had been relentless since September lifted almost overnight. Units that had expected to be overrun by mid-December found themselves holding positions that Americans were no longer attacking. 2 German divisions from the Westwall garrison were pulled out and sent to reinforce the Ardennes offensive, a move that weakened the line but seemed justified given that the line wasn't currently under attack. For soldiers who had been expecting death or captivity within weeks, the sudden operational pause felt like salvation, proof that Hitler's promises of reversal hadn't been empty propaganda after all. The mood in German bunkers shifted from grim determination to cautious optimism. Perhaps the offensive would succeed. Perhaps the Americans would sue for peace. perhaps the war could still end with something other than unconditional surrender. December 22nd through 26th marked the high watermark of German success in the Ardennes and a period of dangerous optimism among Westwall defenders. Local German commanders, emboldened by the successful offensive to their south and freed from constant American pressure, launched limited counteroffensives against American positions that had penetrated the Westwall. Near Monschau, German forces recaptured bunker complexes that had fallen in November. South of Aachen, counterattacks pushed American lines back several kilometers, erasing weeks of costly gains. These attacks succeeded not because German forces had grown stronger, but because American forces were weaker, distracted, and unable to concentrate overwhelming firepower on what had suddenly become a secondary front. The tactical successes were real but strategically meaningless. Recapturing bunkers didn't change the fact that Germany was bleeding to death in the Ardennes, spending its last mobile reserves on an offensive that would succeed brilliantly but briefly before collapsing. January 3rd, 1945, brought the turning point as American forces began their counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The German offensive, which had advanced to within miles of the Meuse River and seemed poised to capture vital supply dumps, stalled for lack of fuel and under pressure from American reinforcements that arrived faster than German planning had anticipated. Patton's Third Army attacked from the south, relieving Bastogne and threatening the southern flank of the German salient. British forces positioned in the north prepared to attack south, creating a pincer that would squeeze the bulge from both sides. German units that had advanced 60 miles in 2 weeks found themselves in a salient that was becoming a trap, surrounded on 3 sides and supplied through a shrinking corridor. The commanders defending the Westwall, who had celebrated their reprieve in late December, received grim orders. No reinforcements available, hold current positions with existing forces, any requests for support would be denied, because everything was committed to extracting forces from the Ardennes disaster. January 16th, the day the American pincer closed and trapped the remaining German forces in the Ardennes salient, marked the true end of Germany's last offensive capability. 80,000 German casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, represented losses that Germany could not replace. Perhaps 300 tanks and assault guns, destroyed or abandoned, represented armoured strength that had taken months to assemble and that would never be reconstituted. Most critically, the offensive had consumed fuel and ammunition reserves that Germany's shattered industrial base couldn't quickly replenish. The forces that might have defended the Westwall effectively through winter and into spring had been destroyed in Belgium, sacrificed for an offensive that gained nothing permanent and cost everything. The defenders still holding Westwall bunkers in mid-January knew they were truly on their own now, that no reinforcements would arrive, that the Americans would return, and that when they returned, they would face defenders who had grown weaker during the pause, while American strength had only grown. The strategic irony was almost cruel in its clarity. The Ardennes offensive had been launched partly to prevent the breakthrough at the Westwall that seemed imminent in early December. By pulling American forces away from the Westwall, the offensive succeeded temporarily in relieving pressure on those positions. But the offensive's failure destroyed the mobile reserves that could have made the Westwall defence sustainable through winter. If Germany had allocated those 30 divisions to defending the Westwall instead of attacking in the Ardennes, the campaign would have been dramatically different. American forces would have faced counterattacks by veteran panzer divisions, penetrations would have been sealed by mobile reserves, and the grinding attrition would have continued, but perhaps with more favourable ratios for the defenders. Instead, Germany had gambled everything on operational brilliance, producing strategic miracle, lost the gamble, and ensured that when American forces returned to the Westwall in February, they would face defenders who were weaker, less supported, and without hope of relief. The pause in Westwall fighting from mid-December to late January represented lost time for the Americans, but also necessary recovery. Divisions pulled from the line and sent to the Ardennes experienced different warfare. Mobile combat rather than bunker assaults, winter fighting in the open rather than siege operations against concrete. When they returned to the Westwall in February, they brought refined tactics for mobile operations, but had to relearn the specialised skills that bunker warfare required. The divisions that had remained on the Westwall line in defensive posture throughout the bulge had rested, received replacements, and absorbed lessons from the 3 months of previous fighting. The balance tilted decisively against Germany. American forces were learning, adapting, and growing stronger. while German forces were static, resource-starved, and increasingly demoralized by the understanding that the Ardennes gamble had failed and nothing stood between them and eventual defeat except concrete, courage, and time. For Private Marcus and thousands like him, the return to Westwall fighting in early February felt like returning to a familiar nightmare after a brief respite. The bunkers were still there, still had to be cleared, still cost casualties with each assault, but something had changed fundamentally. Before the bulge, there had been the sense that this was a hard fight that would eventually be won. After the bulge, there was the certainty that this was a defeated enemy conducting a fighting withdrawal, and that every bunker cleared brought Germany's collapse one step closer. The concrete hadn't changed. The tactical challenges hadn't changed. What had changed was the strategic context. The West Wall was no longer an obstacle that might hold indefinitely, but a barrier that would fall, because Germany lacked the means to sustain its defence. The bulge had interrupted the West Wall campaign, but it had also ensured that when the campaign resumed, it would resume against an enemy that had spent its last reserves on a gamble and had nothing left except the concrete fortifications built in a more hopeful time, manned by soldiers who knew they were dying slowly for a cause already lost. The interruption had seemed like salvation in December. By February, it was clear it had been the final nail in the coffin of German resistance in the West. September 19th, 1944, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Riley of the 4th Infantry Division stood at the edge of the Hürtgen forest, looking at darkness that seemed unnatural even in the pre-dawn gloom. The trees were massive conifers planted in geometric rows, a managed forest designed for timber production rather than natural growth. Their canopy was so thick that even in daylight, the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. His company had orders to advance through this forest toward the town of Schmidt, several kilometres ahead, through terrain that intelligence described as lightly defended. Riley was 22 years old, a platoon leader for 5 months, and he understood instinctively that something about this place was wrong. The forest was too quiet, too dark, too perfect for defence. When his company moved into the tree line an hour later, they entered a different kind of warfare. Something that veterans of Pacific Island fighting might have understood, but that seemed impossible in the European theatre. A green hell where visibility was measured in metres, where every tree might hide a bunker, and where the forest itself became an enemy that killed without mercy or discrimination. The Hürtgen forest fighting would eventually involve 8 American divisions over 5 months, making it the longest single battle American forces fought in the European theatre. The objective seemed simple: control the forest to protect the southern flank of the main West Wall assault, secure the Ruhr River dams that controlled flooding downstream, and deny Germany the use of this terrain for counterattacks. The reality was a nightmare that combined West Wall fortifications with terrain so favourable to defence that every tactical principle favouring attackers disappeared. The forest was approximately 50 square miles of dense conifers, steep ridges, narrow valleys, and road networks that channeled movement into predictable patterns. German engineers had spent years fortifying key positions, creating bunkers that were invisible until you were close enough to be shot, minefields that were impossible to detect under forest debris, and defensive lines that used the trees themselves as obstacles. September through October 1944 saw the 4th and 9th Infantry Divisions ground down, trying to advance through the northern sections of the forest. The tree canopy defeated American air superiority, preventing close air support and making aerial observation impossible. Artillery fire detonating in the canopy created a phenomenon called tree bursts, where shells exploded 30 to 60 feet above ground, showering defenders with wooden shrapnel and steel fragments that increased casualties by 200 to 300% compared to open terrain. The dense trees made tank operations nearly impossible. The few tanks that entered the forest became targets for German anti-tank teams who could approach within meters before firing. Supply became a nightmare because wheeled vehicles couldn't leave roads, and roads were covered by pre-registered German artillery fire. Wounded men often couldn't be evacuated, dying from injuries that would have been survivable with prompt medical attention. Combat distances shrank to ranges where soldiers could hear each other breathing through the undergrowth. November 2nd marked the 28th Infantry Division's attack on Schmidt, a fortified town that dominated the approaches to the Ruhr River dams. The division was relatively fresh, having spent September refitting after the Normandy campaign. Within a week, they would be shattered. The attack plan required advancing through the forest, capturing the town of Schmidt, and holding it against inevitable German counterattacks. The advance went relatively well initially. By November 4th, American forces held Schmidt and seemed poised to break through to the dams. Then the German counterattack began, launched by the 116th Panzer Division, supported by infantry that knew the terrain intimately. American forces, strung out along narrow forest roads and unable to maneuver, were cut off and systematically destroyed. The division lost over 6,000 men in 10 days, including 3,000 captured when entire battalions were surrounded in the forest. The survivors who made it back to American lines were physically and psychologically shattered, many suffering from combat fatigue, so severe they were non-combat casualties for weeks. The medics' experience in the Hürtgen captured the forest's unique horror. Corporal James Walsh, a medic with the 28th Infantry Division, recorded in a diary that would later be published. November 8th. Spent 12 hours trying to evacuate one wounded man, trees too thick for jeep ambulances. Litter carry takes 6 men 8 hours to move, one casualty 2 miles. Man died while we carried him, probably from exposure as much as wounds. Temperature dropped below freezing last night. Ground covered with wounded we can't evacuate. Some been lying in forest 3 days. This isn't war, it's murder. The medical challenge was unsolvable within the constraints. Wounded men needed evacuation quickly, but evacuation required either vehicles that couldn't operate in the forest or litter carriers that exhausted bearers within hours. The result was death from exposure, from shock, from wounds that would have been treatable if treatment could reach them in time. December brought the Hürtgen's worst period. The combination of combat, terrain, and weather-created casualties at rates approaching First World War attrition. Trench foot, a condition where cold and moisture destroy foot tissue, reached epidemic proportions. Over 9,000 non-battle casualties from trench foot alone, more than the division sustained in actual combat over the same period. Combat fatigue, the psychological breakdown from prolonged stress and trauma, affected thousands more. Units would enter the forest at full strength and emerge weeks later with 40 to 50% casualties, half from combat and half from the environment and psychological collapse. Replacements arriving from training camps to fill these losses had life expectancies measured in days. A replacement infantry private reporting to a Hürtgen division in December had perhaps one chance in 3 of surviving to the end of the month, either as combat casualty, environmental casualty, or psychological casualty. The question that haunted American commanders throughout the battle and after was simple. Why? Why continue attacking through terrain that negated American advantages and multiplied German defensive effectiveness? The official answer was strategic necessity. The Ruhr River dams had to be secured to prevent Germans from flooding the river valley and stopping American advances toward the Rhine. The forest provided cover for German artillery observers and counterattack forces. Leaving it in German hands meant accepting a threat to the southern flank of the main offensive. These were rational calculations, but they assumed the forest could be cleared at reasonable cost. When costs exceeded any reasonable calculation, when divisions were being destroyed faster than they could be reconstituted, when it became clear that the forest was consuming American strength at rates that made victory Pyrrhic even if achieved, the strategic logic started to unravel. December 15th brought a temporary operational pause as American commanders reassessed. Several generals argued for bypassing the forest, accepting the threat to the flank in exchange for ending the casualty drain. Others argued for using overwhelming force in one massive assault rather than feeding divisions into the meat grinder sequentially. The decision was to continue, but with adjusted tactics, more artillery support, better winter equipment, rotation of units before they reached complete exhaustion. These measures helped somewhat, reducing casualty rates and preventing complete collapse of attacking units. But they couldn't change the fundamental equation. Attacking through the Hürtgen forest gave defenders every advantage and attackers none. The only way to win was to pay the price, in blood, to accept casualties that would have been scandalous anywhere else, and to grind forward metre by metre until either the forest was cleared or the Germans withdrew. February 10th, 1945, marked the effective end of the Hürtgen forest battle as German forces, facing collapse of the entire Westwall line, withdrew from positions they had held for 5 months. American forces occupied the forest and the towns their predecessors had died trying to capture. Aerial photographs taken in February showed a landscape transformed. 50 square miles of dense forest reduced to a wasteland of shattered trees, cratered earth, and abandoned equipment. The trees that had stood for decades were gone, blown apart by artillery, or simply killed by the concentration of explosive force. Every ridgeline, every valley, every approach road was marked by the debris of battle. Abandoned vehicles, discarded equipment, and the hastily dug graves that marked where units had buried their dead before moving forward. The Hürtgen had been cleared, but at a cost that made victory feel hollow. The final accounting was grim. American casualties exceeded 33,000, killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties were estimated at 28,000, but remain uncertain because record-keeping collapsed during the final phase. Non-battle casualties from environmental causes and combat fatigue added another 9,000 to the American total, bringing the true cost to over 42,000 men for 50 square miles of forest. Division after division had been fed into the Hürtgen and emerged destroyed. The 4th and 9th Infantry Divisions in September-October, the 28th in November, the 1st, 8th, and parts of the 2nd and 90th through December and January. Veterans of the Hürtgen would later form associations separate from other veterans organisations because they felt their experience had been unique, worse than anything else in the European War, and largely forgotten in the emphasis on dramatic battles like Normandy and the Bulge. Lieutenant Riley survived the Hürtgen, one of the statistical minorities who entered the forest in September and walked out in February. His after-action report, written in March 1945, included recommendations that were both tactically sound and emotionally exhausted. The Hürtgen forest should have been bypassed. If military necessity required its capture, it should have been isolated and reduced with overwhelming force in one operation, not a series of sequential attacks that allowed the enemy to defeat us in detail. The terrain negated our advantages in armour, air power, and mobility. The forest itself killed more men than enemy fire. Every tactical principle we teach says to avoid attacking where the enemy is strongest and the terrain most favourable to defence. We attacked anyway, and we paid for it. If we ever face similar terrain again, I recommend we remember the cost and find a different way. His recommendations would influence post-war doctrine about urban and forest combat, helping to ensure that the Hürtgen's lessons wouldn't be completely forgotten. But for the men who died there, for the survivors who carried physical and psychological scars decades later, the lessons came too late. The Hürtgen forest nightmare had killed without mercy, wounded without discrimination, and destroyed units that had fought brilliantly in other battles, all for 50 square miles of forest that might have been bypassed, and that, once captured, proved to have been less strategically vital than the casualties suggested. It was the Westwall campaign's darkest chapter, the place where tactical stubbornness met environmental horror and produced slaughter that achieved objectives of questionable value at costs that were unquestionably excessive. February 8th, 1945, 0400 hours, Captain Michael Stevens of the 78th Infantry Division listened to the opening barrage of Operation Veritable, the British-Canadian offensive, designed to clear the northern section of the Westwall and link up with American forces pushing from the south. 500,000 artillery shells had been stockpiled for the initial bombardment alone, and they were being fired in a 3-hour preparation that made the ground shake 20 miles behind the lines. Stevens and his men would attack in coordination with the British offensive, pushing toward Düren using tactics that had been refined through 5 months of brutal learning. His briefing had been refreshingly honest. The Germans were weaker now, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their reinforcements non-existent after the Ardennes disaster. But they still held concrete bunkers, still had experienced troops who knew how to defend, and still could make Americans pay for every position. The difference was that this time the Americans had learned to, had the resources to sustain offensive operations indefinitely, and most importantly, knew that German collapse was inevitable. This wasn't going to be another grinding stalemate. This was going to be breakthrough. The American army that attacked in February 1945 was fundamentally different from the force that had first encountered the Westwall in September. The specialised equipment that had been improvised in the field was now standard issue. Pole charges, flamethrowers, and Bangalore torpedoes were distributed to every infantry regiment. The M12 gun motor carriages with their 155mm guns were allocated specifically for bunker-busting missions. Combat engineer platoons had been expanded and trained in techniques that combined explosive demolition, flamethrower assault, and infantry coordination. Most critically, the doctrine had evolved from general infantry tactics adapted for fortifications to specialised bunker assault procedures taught to every platoon leader and squad sergeant. The learning curve that had cost thousands of casualties in autumn had produced an army that approached concrete fortifications with systematic efficiency rather than improvisational desperation. February 23rd marked the 9th Armoured Division's assault on Düren, a heavily fortified town that guarded approaches to the Roer River. The division used what had become the standard combined arms technique. Artillery preparation targeting specific bunkers identified through aerial reconnaissance and ground observation, followed by tank infantry teams advancing under smoke cover, with engineers positioned to exploit any penetration. The bunkers around Düren, which might have held for days or weeks in September, fell in hours. German defenders, short of ammunition and demoralised by the Ardennes defeat, surrendered after minimal resistance or retreated to secondary positions. The division advanced 5 miles in 48 hours, a rate that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic or cinematically impressive. It was professional, methodical, and devastating precisely because it was so routine. March 2nd brought perhaps the most innovative bunker-busting technique developed during the entire campaign. Engineers with the 1st Infantry Division discovered that many Westwall bunkers had drainage systems to prevent flooding, systems that connected to the bunker's interior through pipes that were structurally weaker than the main concrete. A team of engineers experimented with placing massive demolition charges, 1,000 pounds of explosives, in the drainage system of a particularly stubborn bunker that had resisted 3 days of assault. The explosion, channeled through the drainage pipes and confined by the concrete structure, destroyed the bunker from the inside, killing or stunning the defenders while leaving the external structure relatively intact. Within a week, engineer units across the front were seeking out drainage systems and using them as entry points for demolitions that had previously been impossible to place effectively. The technique was dangerous. Drainage approaches were often covered by German fire, but it worked when nothing else would. March 5th revealed the extent of German collapse in the Hürtgen sector. An entire regiment of the 347th Volksgrenadier Division, the same unit that had defended stubbornly through autumn and winter, surrendered without sustained fighting. The regiment commander, a major who had lost his left leg at Stalingrad and had been commanding from a wheelchair in his command bunker, explained his decision in a statement that would later be used in intelligence assessments. "We have no ammunition except what's in our weapons. We have no food except what we can forage. We have no medical supplies. We have no reinforcements. We have been ordered to hold, but hold with what? My men are 45 to 60 years old. They've done their duty. Continuing to fight serves no military purpose except to produce German casualties. I refuse to waste their lives for nothing." His surrender was not isolated. Across the Westwall, German units were making similar calculations, understanding that duty and honour had limits when fighting became pointless slaughter. The contrast between September 1944 and March 1945 was stark in every measurable way. Casualty ratios that had favoured German defenders 4-1 in autumn now favoured American attackers 2-1. Time required to clear bunker complexes had dropped from 6 to 8 hours to 1 to 2 hours. American divisions that had been fought to exhaustion in weeks during autumn could now sustain offensive operations for weeks with manageable casualties. German divisions that had held sectors with grim determination in autumn were collapsing or surrendering with minimal resistance. The concrete hadn't changed, but everything else had: American skill, German weakness, and the strategic context that made continued defence militarily meaningless, even if it remained symbolically important to Nazi leadership. March 7th brought the event that rendered the entire Westwall strategically irrelevant: the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact and usable. American forces of the 9th Armoured Division, advancing toward the Rhine as part of the general offensive, discovered that the bridge had not been destroyed as expected. They rushed across, established a bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank, and suddenly the entire strategic calculus of the Western Front changed. The Rhine, the ultimate objective that months of Westwall fighting had been designed to reach, had been crossed. German forces still holding Westwall positions now faced encirclement if they didn't withdraw immediately. The concrete bunkers that had cost so much American blood to capture were now just obstacles to be bypassed as Allied forces poured across the Rhine and into Germany's industrial heartland. The final phase of Westwall fighting through late March became a pursuit operation as German forces abandoned positions that they might have defended weeks earlier. American forces advancing through sectors that had seen brutal fighting in autumn encountered bunkers with doors open, weapons abandoned, supplies left behind. The defenders had withdrawn, not in organized retreat but in dissolution, with units simply melting away as individual soldiers sought to avoid capture while heading vaguely eastward. Some hardcore positions still fought, particularly those commanded by SS officers or party fanatics who believed in final victory or feared summary execution more than they feared American firepower. These positions were bypassed when possible, reduced by overwhelming force when necessary, and generally taken with minimal American casualties because the defenders were isolated, unsupported, and understood that their resistance was futile. The Rhine crossing points that had been the ultimate objective of the Westwall campaign multiplied through late March. After Remagen, American forces established crossings at Boppard, Streetgau, and Worms. British forces crossed at Wessel. The Rhine, which German propaganda had declared would be an impassable barrier where the Allied offensive would die, was being crossed at a dozen locations simultaneously. The Westwall positions that were supposed to prevent Allied forces from reaching the Rhine were now 20 to 40 miles behind the front lines, irrelevant to military operations, occupied by German troops who had been bypassed and who would surrender or be captured in the general collapse that was consuming the Wehrmacht. The campaign that had begun in September with such difficulty was ending in March with something approaching anticlimax. Not dramatic victory, but the systematic dismantling of an enemy who could no longer sustain coherent defence. March 28th, the day that marked the official end of major Westwall operations, found American forces 50 to 80 miles east of the Rhine, racing toward the Elbe River and the link-up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. Behind them, scattered Westwall garrisons still technically held positions, but they were irrelevant to the war's outcome. Some would surrender when contacted, others would hold out for days or weeks before either surrendering or being overrun. A few particularly isolated or fanatical positions would still be fighting when Germany surrendered in May, their defenders unaware or unwilling to accept that the war was over. The Westwall, which had seemed so formidable in September, which had cost over 140,000 American casualties to breach, had become a footnote to the final campaign, a barrier that had delayed but not prevented the inevitable. Captain Stevens, whose division had attacked in coordination with Operation Veritable in early February, found himself in April occupying a German town that had surrendered without resistance, watching German civilians emerge from cellars to begin the work of survival under occupation. He wrote in a letter home that captured the mood of soldiers who had fought through the Westwall's final phase. We broke through. It wasn't one dramatic battle, wasn't a movie moment where everything suddenly changed. It was weeks of hard fighting that gradually got easier as they ran out of everything, and we learned everything. By the end, we were professionals fighting amateurs who happened to have concrete boxes to hide in. The bunkers are still there, thousands of them, and if you look close you can see where our shells scarred them and our explosives cracked them. But nobody's defending them anymore. We won not because we became unstoppable, but because they became unable to stop us. It feels less like victory than like watching something collapse under its own weight. The final assault had succeeded not through any single brilliant tactical innovation or operational breakthrough, but through the systematic application of resources, skill, and determination against an enemy who had run out of resources, time, and hope. The concrete stood, the bunkers remained, but the army defending them had dissolved, and without defenders, even the strongest fortifications were just empty concrete waiting to be bypassed by history. March 1945. Colonel Andrew Harrison, US Army Corps of Engineers, walked through his 500th captured Westwall bunker, making notes in a journal that would eventually become the basis for comprehensive after-action analysis. This particular bunker near Prüm showed classic construction quality variations. The north wall tested at 48 megapascals, nearly perfect concrete that could resist anything short of direct hits by the heaviest weapons, while the south wall tested at 22 megapascals, adequate but vulnerable. The machine gun mounts were brilliantly designed for overlapping fields of fire, but the ventilation system had corroded to uselessness. The reinforcement steel was properly placed in some sections, too shallow in others. The whole structure was a microcosm of the Westwall's paradox. Simultaneously brilliant and flawed, formidable and vulnerable, designed for one war and forced to fight another. Harrison's mission was to answer the question that historians would ask for decades. Why did the Siegfried Line fail? The construction quality varied so dramatically that statistical analysis became essential. Of the 500 bunkers Harrison's team examined in detail, approximately 40% met or exceeded their original design specifications, creating structures that performed as Fritz Tott's engineers had intended in the late 1930s. These bunkers were genuinely difficult to destroy, requiring sustained artillery bombardment or specialized demolition techniques to crack. Another 40% showed moderate quality, strong enough to resist most weapons but vulnerable to determined assault with proper equipment. The remaining 20% were what engineers termed failure specimens, bunkers where rushed construction, poor materials, or inadequate curing had created structures that were weaker than their appearance suggested. This variation meant that attacking forces faced a lottery. Some bunkers would resist everything thrown at them, others would crack under modest pressure, and there was no reliable way to predict which was which until the assault began. The strategic depth problem was fundamental and visible on any map. The Westwall extended 4 to 6 kilometers deep in most sectors, ambitious by First World War standards but inadequate for modern warfare where mechanized forces could penetrate far deeper if initial defenses were breached. True defense in depth required 20 to 30 kilometers of fortified zones, allowing defenders to trade space for time while mobile reserves counterattacked penetrations. The Westwall's shallow depth meant that once attackers broke through the first belt of bunkers, they often had clear runs to the second belt or even to objectives beyond the fortified zone entirely. German doctrine in the late 1930s had assumed that the Westwall would be one element of a defense, including strong mobile forces. When those mobile forces were diverted to the Ardennes or destroyed in Russia, the Westwall became a thin crust, protecting nothing. Force ratios told a mathematical story of inevitable failure. Military theorists generally agreed that successful defense of fortified positions required defenders to outnumber attackers by at least 3 to 1 at points of attack, compensating for attacker advantages in initiative and concentration of force. At the Westwall, the ratio was inverted. By February 1945, Americans outnumbered German defenders roughly 2 to 1 along the entire front, and at specific attack points, American advantages reached 5 or 10 to 1. Static fortifications could multiply defensive effectiveness significantly. Harrison's analysis suggested the Westwall multiplied German combat power by a factor of 2 to 3, but that multiplication wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental numerical disadvantage. Germans needed approximately 360,000 troops to defend the Westwall properly. They had perhaps 120,000, and many of those were Volksgrenadier or undertrained replacements rather than experienced infantry. The learning curve quantification revealed why the campaign's character changed so dramatically between September and March. American efficiency in bunker assault, measured by time required and casualties sustained, improved approximately 250% over 6 months. A bunker complex that required 8 hours and 12 casualties in September required 3 hours and 5 casualties in March. This improvement came from accumulated tactical refinements, better artillery targeting, improved coordination between infantry and engineers, specialized equipment deployment, and refined understanding of bunker vulnerabilities. Multiply this learning across thousands of bunker assaults, and the cumulative effect was transformation. An army that approached fortifications as mysterious obstacles in September treated them as solvable engineering problems in March. German defenders had no comparable learning curve because their strategic situation only deteriorated. Less ammunition, fewer reinforcements, declining morale, and the certainty that time favored their enemies. The economic analysis of the Westwall campaign produced numbers that illustrated the law of diminishing returns. Construction costs had been 3.5 billion Reichsmarks, roughly 20 billion in modern equivalent. The campaign to breach it had cost the Americans approximately $15 billion in direct military expenditure. Ammunition, fuel, equipment losses, and operational costs over 6 months. German defensive costs were lower, but came from a much smaller economy, perhaps $2 billion equivalent in ammunition, supplies, and equipment, costs that Germany could less afford than America could afford its much larger expenditures. Neither side gained economic advantage from the campaign. Both spent vast sums to fight over concrete bunkers that had negligible economic value once captured. The campaign was economically irrational for both sides, but militarily unavoidable. Americans had to break through to reach Germany's industrial heartland. Germans had to defend to delay inevitable defeat. The alternative history modelling that Harrison's team conducted, comparing actual events to theoretical alternatives, suggested several counterfactuals. If Germany had allocated the Ardennes offensive forces to Westwall defence, creating mobile reserves capable of counterattacking American penetrations, the campaign might have extended 4 to 6 months longer, but not changed the outcome. American material superiority would eventually have overwhelmed any defence, but casualties would have been much higher, and the final German collapse delayed into summer 1945. If Germany had maintained the Westwall properly from 1940 to 44 instead of stripping it for the Eastern Front, American forces might have faced genuinely formidable defences that could have required different operational approaches, perhaps extensive sieges or bypass strategies. If Germany had built the Westwall with the 20 to 30 kilometre depth that proper doctrine required, breakthrough might have been delayed until spring or summer 1945. But all these alternatives assumed resources Germany didn't have, or strategic decisions Hitler was incapable of making. The tactical lessons codified in Harrison's report would influence American military doctrine for decades. Frontal assault on prepared fortifications required overwhelming firepower advantage, specialised assault teams, and acceptance of casualty rates that could be sustained only briefly before unit cohesion collapsed. Air power could disrupt and damage fortifications, but couldn't destroy them reliably. Bombardment created as many problems as it solved by cratering terrain and creating rubble obstacles. Combined arms coordination was essential. Infantry, armour, artillery, and engineers had to operate in close coordination, with each assault tailored to specific defensive positions. Most importantly, the report emphasised that static fortifications could delay but not prevent determined assault by forces with material superiority. The Westwall had proven that concrete could buy time but not victory, that fortifications without adequate garrisons and mobile reserves were obstacles rather than genuine defences, and that in modern warfare, linear fortifications were anachronisms that skilled attackers could overcome given sufficient resources and determination. The German perspective, gathered from prisoner interrogations and captured documents, revealed a different set of lessons. German commanders universally acknowledged that the Westwall had delayed American advance, but emphasized that this delay achieved nothing strategically valuable. A divisional commander captured in March told his interrogators, "The Westwall bought us 4 months. 4 months of what? 4 months until we had no army left, no ammunition, no fuel, no hope. If we had used those 4 months to negotiate surrender, we might have saved lives. Instead, we used them to prolong slaughter. The bunkers held, the soldiers fought bravely, and it meant nothing because you had unlimited resources and we had nothing but concrete and courage." This assessment, bitter but accurate, captured the strategic futility of defence without hope of relief or reversal. The final assessment in Harrison's report, stripped of technical detail and reduced to essential truth, concluded that the Siegfried Line failed not for any single reason but through the intersection of multiple failures that reinforced each other. Construction quality variations meant some positions failed when they should have held. Strategic depth inadequacy meant breakthrough led to collapse rather than adjustment to fallback positions. Force ratio disadvantages meant defenders were spread too thin to defend effectively. Resource exhaustion meant German defenders ran out of ammunition, supplies, and will to continue. American tactical learning meant assaults became increasingly efficient and less costly over time. German strategic misallocation meant mobile reserves that might have sustained defence were wasted on offensives that failed catastrophically. The cumulative effect was inevitable. A fortification line that might have been formidable under different circumstances became a costly but surmountable obstacle to forces with the resources, skill, and determination to overcome it. Harrison's personal conclusion, written in his journal but not included in official reports, reflected on the human cost of the campaign. "We spent 6 months and 140,000 casualties to break through fortifications that Germany probably couldn't have defended effectively, regardless of how hard we fought. They spent 80,000 casualties and their last reserves of ammunition and fuel to defend positions they knew they'd eventually lose. Both sides paid prices that seem excessive for outcomes that were probably inevitable. The concrete forced this. We couldn't bypass it, so we had to break it. They couldn't abandon it without surrendering German soil, so we fought over every metre of a line that ultimately mattered less than anyone wanted to admit. The Westwall failed because it had to fail, because Germany lacked resources to defend it properly, and because America had resources to overwhelm it eventually. Everything else, the tactics, the battles, the heroism and sacrifice, was detail in a story whose ending was determined by forces larger than what happened at any individual bunker. The men who died there deserved better than to be statistics in a predetermined outcome. But that's what fortification warfare reduces humans to: expendable assets in a mathematical calculation of concrete strength versus industrial capacity. The Siegfried Line had failed, was always going to fail once strategic circumstances turned against Germany, and the 6 months of fighting had been tragically necessary to prove what might have been predictable from the beginning, that in total war, concrete alone cannot win, and courage without resources only delays the inevitable. March 8th, 1945. Staff Sergeant William Parker of the 2nd Armoured Division stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine River, the first time he had been east of that river since this war began. Behind him stretched the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, crowded with vehicles and troops pouring across in an endless stream that seemed to vindicate every casualty the Westwall campaign had cost. Ahead of him lay Germany proper, no longer protected by fortifications or natural barriers, open to advancing Allied armies that had spent 6 months learning how to break concrete and would now apply those lessons to breaking a nation. The Westwall bunkers that had dominated his life since September were now miles behind him, irrelevant to current operations, occupied by German troops who didn't yet know they had been bypassed. Parker's division was advancing 30 to 40 miles per day, a pace that seemed impossible after months where a mile per day had been ambitious success. The transformation from siege warfare to mobile operations had happened so suddenly that soldiers struggled to adjust, from methodical bunker busting to racing through German towns that surrendered without resistance. The advance rates told the story of German collapse more clearly than any intelligence assessment. In September 1944, American forces advancing against Westwall positions had measured progress in hundreds of meters per day, sometimes less. A mile gained in a day was success. 5 miles in a week was a major victory. Now, in March and April 1945, divisions were advancing 25 to 45 miles per day through German territory that Hitler had promised would be defended street by street, house by house, with the same fanaticism that Aachen had shown. Instead, white flags appeared in windows. Civilians stood by roadsides waiting for Allied forces to arrive. Local officials sought out American commanders to arrange peaceful surrenders of towns that could have been turned into fortresses. The defenders who had made the Westwall so costly to breach had apparently exhausted their will to resist, and without their resistance, the concrete they had defended so determinedly became irrelevant. March 15th through April first saw the encirclement of the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland and the economic engine that had sustained 4 years of total war. American forces advancing north from the Remagen bridgehead linked up with British forces pushing south, trapping approximately 300,000 German troops in a pocket that should have been a fortress but became a prison. Field Marshal Model, commanding the trapped forces, faced the same choices that German commanders had faced at Stalingrad and in Normandy: fight to destruction, attempt breakout, or surrender. He chose a fourth option, dissolving his command and telling his soldiers to seek their own ways home, then shooting himself rather than face capture and trial for war crimes. The pocket collapsed without the dramatic last stand that propaganda had promised, proving that German military resistance had finally broken at the organizational level. Individual units still fought, but the coherent defense that had made the Westwall campaign so difficult had disintegrated. The civilian reception of Allied forces varied from town to town, but generally followed patterns that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. In some towns, Nazi Party officials and SS troops tried to organize resistance, executing defeatists, and forcing civilians and garrison troops to fight. These towns were reduced by artillery and suffered accordingly. In most towns, however, civilian authorities made pragmatic decisions. White flags appeared, small delegations approached, advancing American forces to arrange surrender terms, and occupation proceeded with minimal violence. German civilians emerging from cellars where they had hidden from bombardment showed expressions ranging from relief to exhaustion to numb acceptance. The mythology of Teutonic resistance to the bitter end, the propaganda that had sustained morale through 6 years of war, revealed itself as hollow. Germans were tired, hungry, terrified of Soviet revenge if they ended up in the Eastern occupation zone, and willing to accept American occupation as the least bad option available. March 23 brought General Patton's Third Army across the Rhine at Oppenheim, using assault boats and improvised ferries because the bridges had been destroyed. The crossing succeeded with minimal casualties because German defenders were absent, withdrawn, or surrendered on contact. Within 48 hours, engineers had constructed pontoon bridges and American armor was pouring across. Montgomery's carefully planned Rhine crossing operation, Operation Plunder, launched the same day with massive preparation and overwhelming force. Both operations succeeded easily, proving that the Rhine, which German propaganda had declared the final barrier where Allied advance would stop, was just another river that engineering and determination could cross. The Westwall positions that were supposed to prevent Allied forces from reaching the Rhine were now dozens of miles behind front lines, garrisoned by German troops who were effectively prisoners waiting to be formally captured. The infrastructure paradox surprised Allied planners. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines were cut, and roads were cratered, but the Westwall bunkers remained intact and abandoned. German engineers had destroyed economic and transportation infrastructure to slow Allied advance, but had left military fortifications intact, perhaps because destroying bunkers required explosives that were needed elsewhere, or perhaps because destroying them would acknowledge their irrelevance. American forces advancing through formerly contested areas would encounter bunker complexes that had cost dozens of casualties to capture, now standing empty with doors open and equipment abandoned. The Dragon's Teeth obstacles that had channeled tank movement in September were now just concrete pyramids that advancing armies navigated around when convenient and ignored when not. The fortifications had not been defeated in the traditional sense of being destroyed. They had been bypassed, rendered irrelevant by operational maneuver that made their positions meaningless. April 12th brought news that shocked both sides. President Roosevelt had died. For German forces still fighting, this sparked brief hopes that the Allied coalition would fragment, that Roosevelt's death might lead to separate peace with the Western Allies against the Soviets, that somehow the war's course might still change. These hopes were delusional, the alliance held, and operations continued without pause, but they revealed how desperately German defenders clung to any possibility of avoiding total defeat. For American soldiers, Roosevelt's death was personal loss and historical milestone, the end of an era and the beginning of whatever came after. The war continued, the advance continued, but soldiers understood they were fighting the final phase of a conflict whose political leadership was transitioning even as military operations approached conclusion. The final Westwall positions were cleared not through combat but through surrender negotiations that sometimes resembled real estate transactions. American officers would contact German garrison commanders by radio or messenger, explain that they were surrounded and bypassed, offer honourable surrender terms, and usually receive acceptance after brief deliberation. A captain from the 1st Infantry Division described the process. April 15th, we contacted a bunker complex that we'd tried to take in October and failed. 3 bunkers, maybe 40 German soldiers, sitting there 50 miles behind our lines. I sent a lieutenant with a white flag to talk to their commander. 20 minutes later, they marched out and stacked their weapons. No shots fired. The bunkers they'd defended for 6 months were empty by lunchtime. It felt surreal after what we'd gone through to take similar positions last fall. The anticlimax was total. Positions that had cost lives to approach in autumn were abandoned without resistance in spring. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, found American forces on the Elbe River facing Soviet forces advancing from the east. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Westwall, which had seemed so important in September, which had cost over 140,000 American casualties and 80,000 German casualties to breach, was now just archaeology, concrete bunkers scattered across German landscape, serving no purpose except as reminders of how much effort had been expended on fighting over fortifications that had ultimately proved irrelevant to the war's outcome. Soldiers who had fought through those bunkers experienced complex emotions. Relief that the war was over, satisfaction that they had succeeded, but also troubling questions about whether the campaign had been necessary, whether the costs had been justified, whether there had been a better way. Staff Sergeant Parker, writing in a journal that would be published decades later, captured the mixture of triumph and disquiet that characterized victory. We broke the Westwall, we crossed the Rhine, we beat Germany. These are facts and achievements, but I can't stop thinking about how it ended versus how it progressed. In September, those bunkers seemed unbreakable. In March, we went around them. Did we need to spend 6 months learning how to break them, or could we have bypassed them from the start? Could we have isolated the Westwall instead of assaulting it? I don't know the answers. I do know that friends died taking bunkers that we later walked past without a shot being fired. That's not a criticism of commanders or strategy. It's just the reality of war. You fight with the knowledge you have when decisions are made, not the knowledge you wish you had. We won. That has to be enough. But enough feels less satisfying than I expected victory to feel. The Westwall campaign had succeeded. Germany had been defeated. But the manner of victory raised questions that would echo through military thinking for generations. When fortifications should be assaulted versus bypassed, when attrition is acceptable versus excessive, and how to measure success when the objective is achieved but the cost seems disproportionate to the value gained. May 1945. 22-year-old Private Heinrich Schultz emerged from a Westwall bunker near Trier, hands raised in surrender to American troops, who seemed bored rather than threatening. He had been guarding this position since February, watching American forces advance past him toward Berlin, receiving no orders, no supplies, and eventually losing radio contact with any higher command. When American military police finally arrived to collect isolated German garrisons, Schultz's surrender was processed with bureaucratic efficiency: name, rank, unit, destination for prisoner processing. The bunker he had defended was logged in a report, marked on a map, and essentially forgotten. Within months, American engineers would survey thousands of such bunkers, trying to decide what to do with 18,000 concrete structures that nobody wanted, that served no current purpose, but that were too expensive and time-consuming to demolish completely. The Siegfried Line's military history had ended in March. Its physical legacy had just begun. The immediate post-war period saw contradictory impulses regarding the Westwall fortifications. Some American commanders wanted complete demolition, eliminating any possibility that future German militarism could use these positions. Others argued for preservation as a reminder of war's costs and as insurance against Soviet aggression if the wartime alliance fractured. The compromise was selective demolition. Major bunker complexes near critical infrastructure were destroyed using the massive explosive charges that the military now had available in quantities that made any bunker destructible. Isolated positions in rural areas were sealed, their entrances blocked with rubble, but left structurally intact because demolition would have cost more than ignoring them. By 1947, approximately 5,000 bunkers had been demolished, 12,000 had been sealed or abandoned, and about 1,000 had been converted to various civilian uses, including storage facilities, mushroom farms, and in a few cases, residential structures for the desperately housing-short German population. 1947 brought the Nuremberg Tribunal's examination of Westwall construction as evidence in the case against German military and political leadership. Prosecutors used Organisation TOT's records to demonstrate that massive fortification construction in peacetime proved Germany had planned aggressive war despite public claims of defensive posture. The defence argued that the Westwall was purely defensive, designed only to protect Germany from French invasion. The judges were unimpressed. The timing of construction following immediately after Rhineland remilitarization suggested that Hitler understood he was provoking confrontation and needed fortifications as insurance during the vulnerable period before German rearmament could create genuine military power. The Westwall entered the historical record not just as military installation but as evidence of German intentions in the pre-war period, documents proving planning for the war that eventually came. 1952 brought NATO consideration of reactivating Westwall positions as part of defence planning against potential Soviet invasion. Staff officers examined the bunkers, now 7 years abandoned and further deteriorated, trying to assess whether they could form part of a defensive line against Warsaw Pact forces. The conclusion was negative for multiple reasons. The bunkers faced west toward France, rather than east toward the Soviet threat. Their design was obsolete for modern combined arms warfare involving jet aircraft and tactical nuclear weapons, and most fundamentally, the strategic concept of linear fortification had been discredited by both the Westwall's failure and the broader lessons of the Second World War. NATO doctrine emphasized mobile defense in depth rather than static fortifications. The Westwall was officially deemed irrelevant to modern defense planning, its bunkers relegated to historical curiosity rather than military asset. The 1960s through 80s saw gradual recognition of the Westwall as historical heritage, worth preserving selectively rather than industrial waste to be eliminated. Local historical societies began advocating for preservation of representative bunkers as museums and memorials. The German government, initially reluctant to memorialize anything connected with Nazi militarism, gradually accepted that the Westwall was part of history that couldn't be erased and perhaps shouldn't be forgotten. By the 1980s, approximately 300 bunkers had been preserved in various states, some fully restored as museums, others maintained as ruins with interpretive signage, a few converted into memorial sites with plaques listing soldiers who had died attacking or defending specific positions. The majority remained abandoned, slowly decaying, gradually being reclaimed by vegetation, concrete monuments to an obsolete form of warfare. 1988 marked the 50th anniversary of the Westwall's construction and prompted ceremonies that brought together veterans from both sides. A particularly moving event occurred at a bunker complex near Aachen, where German defenders and American attackers met for the first time since the battle. The elderly men, now in their 60s and 70s, walked through bunkers they remembered from youth, pointing out firing ports they had defended or attacked, sharing stories that revealed the human dimension behind tactical abstracts. A German veteran named Klaus Bauer told an American veteran named Robert Martinez about defending this specific bunker in October 1944. I was 19 years old, so scared I could barely hold my rifle. You were outside trying to kill me. I was inside trying to kill you. Now we're here drinking coffee together, and I'm trying to remember why we were doing that to each other. The ceremonies acknowledged that the Westwall campaign had been necessary from both sides' perspectives at the time, but tragic in retrospect, fought with determination and courage by men who might have been friends in different circumstances. The military doctrine legacy proved more enduring than the physical structures. The American Army's Field Manual 100-5, which codifies operational doctrine, incorporated Westwall lessons throughout the 1950s and 60s. The sections on attacking fortified positions drew directly from techniques developed during the campaign: combined arms coordination, specialized assault teams, systematic reduction procedures. More significantly, the manual emphasized maneuver warfare and operational mobility over frontal assault on prepared positions, reflecting the hard-learned lesson that bypassing fortifications, when possible, was preferable to assaulting them. Soviet military theorists studying the campaign reached similar conclusions, but also noted that American material superiority had allowed them to sustain attritional warfare that less wealthy nations couldn't afford. The Westwall became a case study examined in military academies worldwide, teaching multiple lessons depending on perspective: the limits of fortifications, the importance of combined arms, the value of tactical innovation, and the ultimate primacy of strategy over tactics. 2019 brought renewed interest in Westwall preservation as the generation with living memory of the war began to disappear. Archaeologists conducted systematic surveys of surviving bunkers, documenting construction techniques and battle damage before these structures degraded beyond recognition. One excavation near Hürtgen forest uncovered a flooded bunker whose interior had been sealed since 1945, preserving personal effects of the defenders. Letters from home never delivered, photographs of families never seen again, a diary whose final entry read, March 6th, 1945, the Americans are here, we have no ammunition. I pray this ends soon. These artifacts, mundane and heartbreaking, reminded historians that the Westwall campaign was experienced by individuals whose hopes and fears were identical to people in any era, who happened to be caught in circumstances that turned concrete bunkers into their universe and death into daily possibility. The final statistical accounting, compiled by military historians over decades of research, revealed the campaign's scope with precision that would have been impossible during the fighting. American casualties: 140,000 killed, wounded, and missing over 6 months. German casualties: 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing defending positions they knew would eventually fall. Approximately 500,000 artillery shells fired by both sides, over 2,000 tanks and assault guns lost to mines, mechanical failure, and combat. countless man-hours, billions of dollars expended, an incalculable psychological cost to survivors who carried memories of bunker fighting for the rest of their lives. The Westwall campaign had been the longest continuous battle American forces fought in the European theatre, longer than Normandy, longer than the Bulge, grinding attrition warfare that demonstrated both the limits of fortifications and the terrible cost of breaking them. The modern military consensus, synthesized from decades of analysis, holds that linear fortifications are obsolete in warfare, where air power, mobile armor, and operational maneuver allow enemies to bypass or outflank fixed defenses. The Westwall failed not because American forces developed some revolutionary technique for cracking bunkers. They simply applied overwhelming resources methodically until the defenses broke, but because Germany couldn't defend a 390-mile fortification line with adequate troops, supplies, and mobile reserves. Static defenses require mobile forces to plug breaches and counterattack penetrations. Without those mobile forces, static defenses become elaborate speed bumps that delay but cannot stop determined assault. This lesson, learned at terrible cost in 1944 and 45, influenced Cold War defensive planning, where NATO's Central European defense emphasized mobile forces and defense in depth rather than Maginot-style fortifications. The human legacy remains the most powerful and least quantifiable. Veterans of the Westwall campaign carried physical scars, missing limbs, damaged organs, chronic pain from wounds that never fully healed. They carried psychological scars, nightmares of bunker fighting, survivors' guilt for living when friends died, difficulty adjusting to civilian life where people couldn't understand what they'd experienced. They carried memories of specific bunkers, specific battles, specific moments when life and death separated by inches and seconds. A veteran named Thomas Riley, who survived the Hürtgen forest and lived to age 93, was interviewed shortly before his death in 2015. Asked what he wanted people to know about the Westwall, he said, "Remember that it was hard. Remember that people died there for reasons that made sense at the time but seem questionable now. Remember that soldiers on both sides were mostly just young men doing what they were told and trying to survive. Don't glorify it, but don't forget it either. It happened, we lived through it or died in it, and forgetting it doesn't honor anyone. Just remember, that's enough." The Westwall stands today, or what remains of it, as monument to the 20th century's particular form of madness, industrial-scale warfare, where nations mobilized entire populations and economies to kill each other efficiently. The concrete bunkers scattered across German landscape are memorials not chosen but inevitable, reminders that once nations decided to fight, young men had to die in places like these, attacking or defending positions whose strategic value was always questionable and whose human cost was always excessive. The Siegfried Line failed militarily, succeeded temporarily as obstacle, and endures as memory of what happens when engineering genius combines with strategic stupidity to create fortifications that channel human courage into concrete boxes where it can be systematically destroyed. The legacy is complex, tragic, and ultimately cautionary. Fortifications cannot win wars, can only delay inevitable outcomes at terrible cost, and perhaps most importantly, should be avoided entirely if there is any alternative available. The men who fought there deserved better than to be statistics in attrition warfare. The fact that they became statistics anyway is the Westwall's truest legacy, a reminder that in war, even courage and sacrifice cannot overcome fundamentally flawed strategic decisions, and that concrete cannot substitute for wisdom.